Hi friends, tonight we're going somewhere different. You've heard of Pompeii, the ash, the statues, the city frozen in time. But have you ever lived a day in Pompeii before the eruption? Felt the heat of the ovens? Heard the shouting in the forum? Smelled the bread before the smoke? This isn't a story of lava and fire. It's about the life that came before. The struggle, the sweat, the weight of Roman laws on the shoulders of the poor, and one man trying to sell bread in a city already crumbling beneath his feet. So take a deep breath. Taste the flour in the air. And if you want more stories like this, a like and subscribe goes a long way. And I'd love to know, what time is it where you are and where in the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to know where you guys are from. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and get ready to be taken into a different world. The grey clotted spittle in the bowl told Gaius what he already knew. His lungs were slowly filling with the mountain's breath. He'd seen it in older men before him, how they withered from the inside out, lungs turning to stone. Each year brought more ash, more coughing, more men who simply stopped waking up. Gaius shuffled toward the pistrinum, his leather soles scraping against the pitted stone street. The weight of the dough sack pulled at his shoulder, a familiar pain he barely noticed anymore. His mind wandered back to Vibia, curled up like a cat in their cramped corner. The girl was becoming too much like her mother. Clever words, defiant eyes, dreams bigger than their station. It would only bring her grief. The tremor passed quickly, but Gaius couldn't shake the unease it left behind. The mountain had been restless lately. More shakes, more ash, more whispers among the old women about angry gods. Not that it mattered to him. Gods cared as little for bread sellers as patricians did. Inside the pistrinum, the heat hit him like a slap. Sweat immediately beaded on his forehead, mingling with the fine dusting of flour that covered everything. The two younger vendors, Quintus and Drusus, had already claimed the prime spots nearest the oven's mouths. Finally decided to join us, Crispus? Quintus grinned, his teeth too white, his tunic too clean. His father had connections with the grain merchants. You're getting slower every day. Should have woken earlier, old man, Drusus added, not even looking up from his kneading. Gaius gripped his paddle tighter, feeling the worn wood smooth against his calloused palm. The back wall, his spot now, stood next to the chamber pot, where the heat was uneven and the smell unbearable. His dough would rise pearly there, and customers could always tell the difference. "One day, I'll beat you all here," Gaius muttered, trudging toward his corner. "What was that?" Quintus cupped his ear mockingly. Gaius didn't answer. He unloaded his sack, spreading his dough on the floured surface. His hands moved automatically, 30 years of muscle memory taking over. Knead, fold, press. Knead, fold, press. The rhythm steadied his breathing, calmed his anger. Behind him, the two younger men laughed about something, probably him. Gaius kept working, his weathered fingers pressing into the soft dough. He'd been at this longer than they'd been alive. Yet here he was, relegated to the worst spot, next to human waste, fighting for scraps. The pistrinum choked with smoke, sweat, and flour dust, a hell of clay and flame. Vendors shouted over the constant roar of hearths, each one fighting for their piece of the scorching inferno. Gaius squinted through the haze as a water-bearer sprinted past, splashing his tunic. The dome trapped every curse, every cough, every complaint in its baking-hot confines. Gaius lifted his proofed loaves onto the wooden board, running a calloused finger along the surface. A few cracks marred the dough. He'd been too distracted, too angry during kneading. Still, they'd sell. They had to. He dribbled olive oil across the tops, his hands betraying him with their trembling. The hour of baking was upon him. Across the room, a younger man yanked his paddle from the communal oven with a scream. "Merda!" The Oscan curse cut through the din as blackened lumps tumbled onto the stone floor. "The oven's running too hot. Someone stoked it too soon." The vendor waved frantically at the smoke clouding his eyes, watching helplessly as his ruined bread darkened further in the waste bin. Gaius stepped forward, gesturing toward the tally slate mounted on the wall. "I'm next. My name's there." The chalk marks were clear enough, even in this light, even to men who couldn't read. The young vendor whirled around, face flushed red from heat and humiliation. "I'm not putting this into the street." He blocked Gaius's path to the oven mouth. "I need another run." "That's not how it works." Gaius's voice rose above the bakery's chaos. "You burned your lot. You're done." Other bakers glanced over, their hands never stopping their work. A flour-covered man waved his arms, trying to separate them before things escalated. The Peaster's assistant materialized from the smoke, scratching his stubbled chin. "Give him one more go," he muttered, avoiding Gaius's eyes. "You'll go after." "Another go?" Gaius's knuckles whitened around his paddle. "My dough's already turning." The assistant merely shrugged, taking his stylus to the slate. With 3 quick strokes, Gaius's name vanished, replaced lower on the list. 3 names now stood between him and salvation. 3 hours of waiting while his dough died a slow death. Gaius trudged back to his workbench, each step heavier than the last. The cloth-lined bowl held his remaining dough. Already the bubbles were thinning, the surface beginning to dry and form a premature crust. Overproofed. Ruined. He plunged his hands into the mass, trying to reshape it, but the sticky dough clung to his palms like a desperate lover. Each pull and fold made it worse, stretching and tearing where it should have sprung back. He dusted more flour across the surface, trying to salvage what remained of his day's work. A vendor at the next bench sneered. "Better luck tomorrow, Crispus." Gaius wiped sweat from his brow, leaving a streak of flour across his forehead. "By the gods," he whispered, half prayer and half curse. "Let these loaves live long enough to sell." He lifted his gaze to the smoke-blackened ceiling. Or strike the Pister's tongue with boils. He raised his paddle and waited again. Gaius hoisted the bread cart onto his shoulders, the leather straps digging into his flesh like the yoke of an ox. He grimaced as the weight settled, sending a familiar stab of pain down his spine. The wooden push-cart, laden with warm but slightly deflated loaves, creaked in protest. The broken wheel wobbled pathetically as he dragged it through the narrow alley, scraping against stone walls. The morning sun hung high overhead, mocking his tardiness. "Move, you worthless pile of splinters," he muttered, yanking the cart around a tight corner. The streets thickened with noise and bodies. Merchants bellowed prices. Goats bleated in protest as they were dragged to market, and everywhere deals closed with the clink of coins. Gaius squeezed past fishmongers dumping yesterday's rotten catch, the stench making his eyes water. Slaves balanced precarious jugs of garum on their shoulders, the fermented fish sauce leaving its unmistakable trail in the air. Vendors with dyed tunics stretched across makeshift frame competed with roasted chickpea sellers, their voices a constant barrage against his ears. "Watch it!" A water carrier sidestepped as Gaius's cart nearly clipped his ankle. The forum materialized ahead, a buzzing hive of commerce framed by imposing stone columns that cast long, cool shadows across the flagstones. Statues of emperors and gods stared down, with blank, indifferent eyes at the chaos below. Every corner, every sliver of space had been claimed. Butchers hacked at bloody cuts, jugglers tossed colored balls for copper coins, spice traders wafted exotic scents from distant lands. And there, spread across the prime locations, 5 bread sellers already screamed their wares at the passing crowd. Gaius's heart sank as he scanned for space. Slim pickings remained. His usual spot against the eastern wall had been commandeered by a richer vendor whose polished stall gleamed under a striped canopy. 2 hired criers flanked the man's display, their practiced voices carrying farther than Gaius's could ever hope to reach. After a desperate circuit, he found only a sliver of wall beside a cracked column. A beggar with flies buzzing around an infected foot eyed him suspiciously from the shadow. "This is all that's left?" Gaius grumbled, unstrapping the cart from his shoulders. He unfurled his threadbare cloth across the uneven ground and arranged his loaves in neat rows. Some were misshapen, deflated from their overlong proof. He strategically positioned the worst offenders behind the fresher ones, creating an illusion of abundance. The scent of honey crust lingered faintly, his only weapon in these bread wars. Drawing a deep breath, Gaius began his daily battle cry. Fresh flatbread. Still warm, no chaff, no lies. Panis for the people. His voice cracked by the 10th repetition, the strain of shouting over the market's din already taking its toll. A nearby child with a dirty face mimicked his hoarse calls, dancing mockingly before darting away into the crowd. A middle-aged woman approached, bending to sniff a loaf. Her fingers prodded the crust, testing its give. "Too flat," she declared, straightening and walking away without another word. Gaius clenched his jaw as a vendor 3 stalls down immediately shouted, "Buy 2, get a free fig." The crowd flocked toward the offer like gulls to a fishing boat. The ground trembled slightly beneath his feet. Another minor shake, barely noticeable amid the commotion. Before Gaius could steady his display, a mounted centurion pushed through the forum, his horse's flank knocking 3 loaves into the dirt. The soldier didn't even glance back as he continued his casual patrol. Gaius retrieved the fallen bread, brushing off ash and grime with shaking hands. He considered returning them to the stack. 3 loaves meant the difference between eating tonight or going hungry. But he knew Lucius Faustus's inspectors prowled the forum, eager to levy fines for the smallest infractions. With a quiet curse, he set them aside. Sweat dripped down his back as he resumed his calls, throat raw and voice cracking. The vendors around him drowned each other out in a cacophony of competing offers. A mime tumbled nearby, stealing attention. A slave auctioneer's hammer struck behind him, punctuating his words with sharp cracks. Amid the chaos, Gaius shouted louder, because quitting sold nothing, and nothing meant hunger. Morning light filtered into the cramped room, dust motes dancing through the narrow shaft of sunshine. Vibia sat cross-legged by the window, quill in hand, parchment balanced precariously on her knee. She squinted in the dim light, leaning closer to make out the faded text she was copying. She dipped into cheap ink made from crushed walnut and wine sediment, the dark liquid clinging to her fingertips as she worked. Whereas the party of the first part shall forfeit all claims to said property if payment is not rendered within. She murmured to herself as she copied the legal scroll from a client, her side gig to earn extra coin. The wealthy scribe's son paid well for work he considered beneath him. Her eyes drifted to the loose stone beneath her sleeping pallet. Hidden there lay her true passion, a biting satire about Lucius Faustus she'd composed last week. She reread a line in her mind. He weighs bread with gold and justice with air. Perfect rhythm. Cutting truth. She smirked, then grew serious. Words like those could draw punishment from men like Faustus. The last poet who mocked a magistrate had his tongue cut, a merciful alternative to execution. Still, she couldn't help the fire that stirred in her when she wrote, the way the right phrase could strip bare the corruption everyone pretended not to see. A fly buzzed over a nearby stale crust, remnants of yesterday's meager dinner. She flicked it away and used the moment to stretch her back, sore from hours of hunching over scrolls. Her shoulders cracked in protest. She heard distant yelling from the forum, her father's voice, unmistakable even from here, rising over the din. The same desperate pitch, the same hollow promises of fresh bread that grew staler with each passing hour. She paused her pen and sighed, weary of the cycle that trapped them both. A neighbor's baby started crying through the wall, its wails piercing the thin plaster. She closed her eyes. The noise, the ash, the heaviness of Pompeii pressed in on her. Sometimes she imagined the weight of the entire city crushing her slowly, one day at a time. She returned to her scroll, faster now, fingers flying across the parchment. This client at least paid in clean coin, not the grimy, worn-down copper that other scribes offered. If she finished quickly, she might even have time to revise her newest poem before delivering this one. She folded the scroll neatly, binding it with a thin leather cord, then retrieved her hidden poem from beneath the stone. She carefully refolded the satirical piece into a waxed scrap pouch for safekeeping or later posting near the public baths where everyone would see. If Rome is marble, Pompeii is mud, and the pigs have learned to walk upright. She whispered the line to herself and smiled softly, tucking the poem into her belt pouch. She hid it again and prepared to leave, smoothing her simple tunic and checking her ink-stained fingers. The words would find their audience soon enough. The morning heat clung to Gaius like damp wool, seeping through his tunic and pooling in the small of his back. He wiped sweat from his brow with a grimy forearm, leaving a smudge of flour across his temple. His fingers worked mechanically, rearranging the remaining loaves in a neater row, spreading them out to make 5 look like 10. A low rumble rolled beneath the forum stones, vibrating up through the soles of his worn sandals. At first, Gaius thought it was a heavy cart passing nearby. Then the stall roof groaned above him. The columns rattled. A clay jug on a fishmonger's stall tipped and shattered against the stone, spilling brine and tiny silver fish across the pavement. A brief silence gripped the square. The constant shouting ceased. The haggling stopped mid-sentence. No footsteps, no animal brays, just creaking wood and shifting stone. Then, a collective breath, as if the entire forum inhaled at once. "She stirs again," someone yelled from near the temple. A customer abandoned a half-filled basket at a fruit stall, fleeing toward the street. A slave dropped his amphora, wine spilling like blood across the white stone. A child started to cry, high and thin against the sudden quiet. Gaius clutched the edge of his cart and waited it out. His legs felt hollow, like reeds bending in a storm, but he didn't move. Couldn't move. The tremor subsided after 6 long seconds that stretched like hours. The volcano loomed in the distance, cloaked in morning mist. No smoke, no fire. Just that heavy, ever-present shadow watching over their lives. Gaius spat to the side and muttered, "Go back to sleep, old girl." A priest in saffron robes began praying loudly near the temple steps, arms raised toward the mountain. People tossed coins into his bowl, eager to buy safety from the gods. Gaius watched the hypocrisy with scorn. The same priest who took bribes from wealthy merchants now promised protection he couldn't deliver. "No damage. Carry on." A magistrate's clerk announced from the steps, scroll in hand, as if that was all it took to keep the city from cracking in half. The crowd groaned, then resumed their bartering, voices gradually rising back to their normal cacophony. Gaius noticed a fine crack snaking through the forum floor, right beneath his cartwheel. Thin, but real. Fresh. He nudged the cart back a step, pretending not to care, pretending not to see. He took a deep breath and started shouting again. Warm bread, only a few left. But this time, his voice was hoarse. And for the first time, he wondered how many more shakes Pompeii could survive before the mountain finally lost its patience. The crowd parted like water around a stone as Lucius Faustus glided into the forum. His pristine white toga bore not a speck of the ash that coated everyone else. A scrawny scribe trailed behind him, wax tablet clutched to his chest, stylus poised. Lucius moved with the casual confidence of a man who knew the world bent to his will, not the other way around. The scent of myrrh clung to him, a sharp contrast to the forum's usual blend of sweat and rotting produce. He stopped at Cassia's stall, his lips curling at the sight of her bruised figs and day-old bread. Overripe. Lucius flicked a fig onto the ground with his manicured finger. It split open, revealing soft, fermenting flesh. Cassia bowed, her smile strained like an old rope about to snap. "Fresh batch coming tomorrow, sir. Perhaps—" Lucius had already moved on, his bronze seal swinging from his belt like a pendulum marking time until the next victim. At the next stall, plump Servius leaned forward, pressing something into Lucius's palm while pretending to show him a loaf. The coin vanished into Lucius's robes. He lifted the bread, examined it with theatrical care, then nodded approvingly. The scribe's stylus remained still. Gaius watched the familiar dance from his stall, jaw tight. His eyes darted to where Vibia stood half hidden behind a column, her face a storm cloud. Lucius stopped at old Fulvia's stall next. He produced a small bronze scale from his belt pouch and set it on her counter with a decisive clack. "Let's see." He placed one of her loaves on the scale. The balance tipped. "Under legal weight, Fulvia. You know the law." She reached for a small clay pot. Perhaps a boiled egg would— 2 denarii. His voice fell flat as a dead man's. "Pay or close?" Gaius smoothed his display as Lucius approached, arranging his remaining loaves in a pathetic attempt at abundance. He felt rather than saw Vibia tense behind her column. Lucius picked up Gaius's largest loaf, tapping it with his stylus. The hollow sound echoed between them. Dense, uneven crumb. He tore off a piece without asking and chewed slowly, eyes never leaving Gaius's face. "Still using last week's flour, are we?" "No complaints from buyers." Gaius kept his voice steady, though his hands ached to close around Lucius's throat. "You don't sell enough to hear complaints." The scribe's stylus scratched across wax. Inconsistent texture, probable spoilage. 3 denarii fine. Lucius smiled thinly. "You know I don't have it." Gaius's voice dropped to a growl. Lucius leaned in close enough that Gaius could smell the myrrh mixing with wine on his breath. "You should tell your daughter to be more careful with her writing. Clever words are dangerous in foolish hands." He straightened, adjusting his toga with a practiced flick. His sandals clicked against the stone as he moved away, the scribe scurrying after him like a well-trained dog. Gaius stood frozen, rage boiling beneath his skin as the crowd flowed around him, eyes carefully averted. No one had heard, no one would help. And somehow Lucius knew about Vibia's poems. Gaius trudged home under the sweltering afternoon sun, his empty cart creaking behind him. The weight of the fine pulled at his shoulders more than any load of bread ever could. 3 denarii might as well have been 300. The forum had emptied, leaving him alone with the dust devils that spun lazily across the paving stones. His sandals scraped against the hot stone with each step, the leather worn thin at the heels. A skinny boy crouched in the shadow of a wall, gnawing on discarded olive pits, his ribs pressed against. Dirty skin like the bars of a cage. The child's eyes followed Gaius with the wariness of a strayed dog. Without breaking stride, Gaius reached into his sack and pulled out the heel of a loaf. Burnt on one side, squashed on the other. The boy snatched it and vanished down an alley, bare feet slapping against stone. Tertius, the cobbler, waved from his doorway but quickly looked away when Gaius turned. The news traveled faster than bread could cool. Lucius had fined Gaius again. Everyone knew what that meant. One more crack in an already crumbling life. One step closer to losing his vendor's license. Tertius pretended to adjust his awning, avoiding conversation. Gaius turned into the cramped courtyard of his insula. Laundry hung limp from lines stretched between buildings, faded tunics and threadbare sheets flapping like the banners of a defeated army. A mangy cat darted between his legs, nearly tripping him. He climbed the wooden stairs, each step creaking under his weight, his back protesting every movement. Inside their single room, Vibia hunched over her scrolls, fingers stained with ink. The space smelled of boiled lentils and cheap lamp oil. She glanced up as the door swung open, her eyes moving from his face to the empty cart outside. "How much this time?" she asked, setting her pen down. Gaius lowered himself onto a stool with a groan. 3 denarii, said the loaves were too dense. Maybe I should start baking clouds. Vibia set a chipped bowl of watery lentil stew in front of him. The surface shimmered with a thin film of oil. Their last drops. "We can't keep doing this. The bribes, the fines, it's always the same." Gaius ate slowly, chewing each spoonful deliberately. His mind circled back to Lucius's warning about Vibia's writing. How had he known? Who had told him? He swallowed hard, tasting fear more than food. "We need to fight back," Vibia said, more to herself than to him. She stared at the ink stains on her knuckles. Not with fists, with something they can't unhear. Gaius stared into his bowl, watching the lentils settle at the bottom like silt in a river. When he spoke, his voice was low and bitter. "I fought once. I lost everything but that cart and you. That's not a fight I win again." The moon hung over Pompeii, casting silver light across tiled roofs and painting the narrow streets in shades of blue-black shadow. The city had settled into its nightly slumber, punctuated only by drunken laughter echoing from distant taverns and the occasional bark of a restless dog. The mountain loomed dark against the stars, a sleeping giant against the night sky. Vibia slipped a scroll into her satchel and wrapped herself in a plain shawl, pulling it low over her face. She padded across the room, her sandals bound with strips of cloth to muffle her steps. She paused beside the shuttered window where Gaius lay sprawled on his thin mattress. His chest rose and fell with each snore. His weathered face relaxed in sleep, the lines of worry temporarily smoothed away. She eased the door open and slipped into the night. The streets felt different after dark, more intimate, more dangerous. The ash-smudged walls of the insulae leaned in around her like conspirators. She pressed herself against the cool stone whenever footsteps approached, avoiding the pools of torchlight that would betray her presence. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she ducked beneath a clothesline, dodging the known patrol routes of the night watch. Passing a small shrine to Mercury, she paused. The moonlight caught the god's worn stone face, his expression both mischievous and knowing. Vibia touched the base of the shrine with ink-stained fingers. "Let my words fly faster than his punishment," she whispered, before melting back into the shadows. The public bulletin wall near the bathhouse stood cluttered with notices, a patchwork of city life. Lost property, slave sales, announcements of grain shortages. One fresh notice declared, "Worship of Bacchus now subject to fine." Vibia's lip curled. Another freedom taxed away. She carefully pulled out her poem, unrolling the small scroll with reverent hands. The words glared back at her in her finest lettering, a scathing satire aimed directly at Lucius. "The one who weighs our bread has never known hunger, only appetite." She pinned it to the wall using a sharpened fishbone, pressing it firmly into the wood. She smoothed the corners, straightened it, and stepped back. Surrounded by mundane messages, this one burned like a coal among ashes. Footsteps approached. Vibia ducked behind a nearby column, pressing her back against the cold stone. Her breath caught in her throat as 2 young men stumbled past, arms draped over each other's shoulders, singing off-key. They swayed dangerously close to her hiding place, but noticed neither her nor the freshly posted poem. Once the street fell quiet again, she slipped away, retracing her steps through the sleeping city. Her hands trembled, from the night chill or from the thrill of defiance. She couldn't tell. In the shadows near the temple portico, a hooded figure stood motionless, watching the bulletin board. The figure's eyes lingered on the fresh scroll, then tracked the direction of Vibia's retreat, noting the way she moved, the ink stains visible on her fingers in the moonlight. Dawn broke over Pompeii, and the first rays of sunlight glinted off the forum's marble columns. A crowd had already gathered around the bulletin wall near the baths, their murmurs rising like the morning mist. At the center of attention was Vibia's poem, its sharp letters cutting through the mundane notices surrounding it. A burly butcher with blood-stained forearms pushed to the front, clearing his throat theatrically. "Listen to this." He puffed out his chest, one hand raised dramatically. "Appetite dressed as law, bread lighter than justice." His voice boomed across the forum. "Beware the man who measures bread but not his conscience." Laughter rippled through the crowd, starting as nervous titters before swelling into open guffaws. A fruit seller slapped her thigh, nearly toppling her basket of figs. A flour-dusted baker at the edge of the gathering spat on the ground. His mouth twisted in a half-smile that didn't reach his worried eyes. "They'll blame us all for this. Mark my words, inspectors don't care who wrote it, only who they can find." He glanced nervously over his shoulder. Poetry costs more than grain these days. A young scribe with ink-stained fingers lingered just long enough to memorize the verses before slipping away through the crowd. His sandals slapped against the stone as he hurried toward the wealthy district. He'd heard whispers that Lucius Faustus was paying well for leads about the mysterious wall poet. Across town, Lucius reclined on a dining couch, breaking his fast with honeyed figs and fresh cheese. A servant approached with bowed head, offering a small parchment. "From the forum, sir." Another posting. Lucius wiped fig juice from his fingers and unrolled the parchment. He read it once, then again. Slower. His customary smirk faded. "Too clever," he muttered. "Too targeted." The phrasing triggered something in his memory. The careful construction, the biting precision. His mind conjured Vibia's face at her father's stall, calm, sharp-tongued, too poised for her station, always watching, always with ink-stained fingers. "She's always writing," he whispered. Lucius held the parchment over a nearby oil lamp. The flame caught eagerly, consuming the words. Ash fluttered into his wine cup, gray specks swirling in the dark red liquid. "Find out where she lives," he ordered his assistant without looking up. "Quietly. Number of fuss. Yet." Back in the forum, a city official tore down the offending poem with a scowl, but the damage was done. Already, 3 copies had appeared on walls across the city, and a tavern bard was committing the verses to memory. A flour-dusted vendor leaned against his cart, watching the commotion with tired eyes. "This city doesn't need a volcano to burn," he muttered to no one in particular. "It'll do just fine with words." Gaius shouldered his cart through the forum gates, where a tangle of vendors clogged the narrow entrance. A troop of flute players blocked half the pathway, their reedy melodies lost in the chaos of shouting merchants. "Make way!" Gaius angled his cart sideways, wincing as his back protested. "Just trying to pass." A vegetable seller with garlic braids hanging from his arms refused to budge. "Wait your turn, breadman." Gaius ducked under a swinging basket of dates, muttering apologies as he pushed forward. The morning heat already pressed down, threatening to stale his precious cargo before he could sell a single loaf. Ahead, a mule-drawn cart stacked precariously with wine amphorae wobbled on the uneven cobblestones. The beast's sides heaved with effort, foam flecking its mouth as its driver shouted curses and cracked a small whip. The animal's hooves slipped slightly on the smooth stones, worn down by centuries of Roman sandals. The mule's front legs buckled without warning. It dropped to its knees with a pained bray, then collapsed onto its side. The cart lurched violently, tilting until gravity won. Amphorae crashed against stone, the sharp crack of breaking pottery followed by gasps from the crowd. Dark red wine gushed across the cobblestones. A wooden crate of fresh bread tumbled from the cart's edge, loaves scattering like dice across the forum floor. "The wine!" "Save the wine," the cart owner wailed, diving for intact jugs. Children materialized from nowhere, darting between adult legs to snatch rolling loaves. A woman in a faded stola dropped to her knees, collecting spilled wine in a broken amphora neck. Gaius moved without thinking. Those loaves were still warm, still edible. He lunged forward, gathering 3 in one sweep of his arm. The bread was good. Better than his, if he was honest. Crusty exterior, soft center, properly risen. That's theft, Crispus. A heavy hand clamped onto his shoulder. Gaius looked up into Flaccus's pockmarked face. The rival bread seller stood with arms crossed, a self-righteous sneer twisting his lips. I'm saving bread, not stealing it. Gaius straightened, clutching the rescued loaves. It'll rot in the street. Not yours to save. Flaccus's voice rose. Put them down, or I'll call the aedile. For what? Preventing waste. Gaius stepped closer. The owner's busy with his wine. These loaves will be trampled. The crowd formed a loose circle around them, argument always more entertaining than commerce. Someone whispered a wager. Bread thief, Flaccus shouted. Common criminal. A thin man with a wax tablet appeared at the edge of the commotion. His official's tunic was pristine despite the dusty air, his expression bored. Disturbance of trade, unauthorized removal of goods. He flicked his stylus across the tablet without looking up. 1 denarius fine. Gaius's shoulders slumped. He didn't argue, couldn't afford to make it worse. The official held out his hand expectantly while Flaccus smirked and sauntered away, mission accomplished. Behind them, the mule groaned and struggled to stand on trembling legs. Gaius placed the coin in the official's palm, then gathered what bread he could salvage. Some loaves were flattened, others stained with wine and dirt. He placed them in his cart with shaking hands. The gods eat first, he muttered, watching the official disappear into the crowd. We get the crumbs. Gaius returned too. His stall, face flushed and jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. He set the salvaged loaves on the table, carefully brushing dirt from one with his sleeve. The crust crumbled slightly beneath his fingers, sending tiny fragments onto the wooden counter. Fresh bread, he called, voice hollow. Best in the forum. A woman in a faded blue stola approached, her eyes scanning the display. She noticed the wine stains on one loaf, the cracked edges of another. Her nose wrinkled. These look handled, she said, backing away. Just a small accident. The inside is perfect. Gaius broke one open to show the soft center, but she was already walking toward Flaccus's stall. Another customer pointed at the dirt-smudged crust. How much for the clean ones? 2 as for 3 loaves. The man snorted. Flaccus offers 4. His aren't baked as well. But the customer was gone, melting into the crowd. Gaius watched his potential earnings dissolve with each passing glance and dismissal. Vibia appeared through the market throng, water jug balanced on her hip. She took one look at her father's face and set the jug down with a thud. What happened now? Her eyes caught the fine notice tucked into his belt. Gaius adjusted a loaf unnecessarily. A mule collapsed. Tried to save the bread. Got fined for disturbing trade. The words came out clipped, each one a pebble dropped into still water. Vibia's fists clenched at her sides. That's robbery, not justice. Her voice carried across the neighboring stalls. Keep your voice down. Gaius grabbed her wrist, eyes darting around. They're always listening. An inspector in a crisp tunic passed by their stall, pausing to eye their bread with calculated disinterest. His gaze lingered on Vibia's angry face before he moved on. Gaius's heart hammered against his ribs. He waited until the official disappeared into the crowd before reaching beneath his tunic. From a small leather pouch sewn into the lining, he withdrew a denarius, one of his last silver coins. His fingers trembled slightly as he counted what remained. 3 copper asses and a hafiz with a worn edge. Wait here, he muttered to Vibia. He walked to the Edel's station near the forum entrance, where a bored clerk sat beneath a canvas awning. Gaius placed the coin on the wooden table without a word. The clerk didn't look up. He simply made a scratch in his ledger and flicked his hand dismissively, already focused on the next transaction. When Gaius returned, Vibia stood rigid beside their cart, glaring across the market. Flaccus laughed with another vendor, counting a small pile of coins. His stall bustled with customers. Vibia's knuckles were white around the water jug's handle. Gaius exhaled slowly and sank onto the edge of the cart. This city bleeds you with a smile. He stared at their remaining inventory, some half-crushed, some whole, and counted silently in his head. 1 more fine would mean no grain for tomorrow. 2 would mean no rent. He wondered how many more denarii stood between bread and dignity, between survival and ruin. The forum heaved with midday chaos. Bodies pressed against bodies, sweaty tunics clinging to backs as the sun beat down mercilessly. Fish vendors shouted prices that competed with cloth merchants, the smell of grilled mackerel mingling with the stench of unwashed feet and donkey dung. Gaius slumped against his stall's support beam, throat raw from hours of hawking wares. His voice had deteriorated to a sandpaper whisper an hour ago. He watched the crowd flow past his meager display, eyes tracking potential customers who barely glanced his way. 3 loaves remained unsold, their crusts darkening in the heat. A matron in expensive purple-trimmed silk approached, flanked by a slave girl carrying her purchases. Silver rings glinted on each finger as she gestured toward Gaius's bread. Her nose wrinkled as though she'd encountered something foul. "Look at these," she murmured to her attendant. Bruised like a gladiator's face. Gaius straightened, plastering on his merchant smile. He lifted the last honey-glazed flatbread, his premium offering saved for wealthier customers. "Fresh this morning, Domina, sweetened with Cretan honey." She flicked her wrist dismissively. "I can smell the cheap flour from here." She turned to leave but paused, looking back over her shoulder. Some vendors should know when to leave the forum. Not everyone belongs in commerce. Vibia stepped forward from where she'd been refilling water cups. Her movement was fluid, deliberate. Some buyers should know when to close their mouths. The market noise seemed to dim. The matron froze, then pivoted slowly. "Who is this insolent girl?" Her voice carried, drawing eyes from neighboring stalls. "Vibia, please." Gaius reached for her arm, but she stepped beyond his grasp. "That bread was made before sunrise," Vibia said, her voice clear and steady. "Baked with flour taxed twice, dough risen in heat that cracks skin, and carried here through streets that stink of your husband's politics." Heads turned. A fishmonger paused mid-transaction. A fruit seller leaned forward over his melons. Someone in the back of the gathering crowd let out a low whistle of appreciation. Even Flaccus abandoned his sales pitch to watch, eyebrows raised. The matron's face flushed crimson beneath her powder. "How dare you? Do you know who my husband is? The magistrate will hear about this public indecency." She spun away, sandals slapping against stone as she stormed off, her slaves struggling to keep pace. Gaius grabbed Vibia by the elbow, yanking her behind the stall. "Are you trying to get us arrested?" he hissed, panic rising in his chest. She jerked her arm free. "I'm trying to get someone to listen." Her eyes blazed with a fire he hadn't seen since her mother died. Then, quieter but no less intense. "You've shouted bread for 20 years and no one heard. Maybe it's time we shouted something else." The sun dipped toward the western hills, bathing the forum in liquid gold. Long shadows stretched across worn cobblestones as vendors folded linens, packed unsold wares, and swept debris from their patches of stone. The market's frantic energy dissolved into weary sighs and creaking carts. Pompeii exhaled after a day of commerce, the air cooling as citizens drifted homeward. Gaius slumped beside his weathered cart, counting the day's earnings. 5 copper coins lay in his palm, edges worn smooth from countless transactions. Just enough for tomorrow's flour, not enough for oil. His back throbbed where an old injury never quite healed. His hands, stained with ash, flour, and the stubborn residue of dough, trembled slightly as he tucked the meager sum into his belt pouch. Vibia sat cross-legged nearby, hunched over a wax tablet balanced on her knees. Her stylus scratched furiously across the surface, carving words into the soft material with practiced precision. Her brow furrowed in concentration, lips moving silently as she composed. Something burned behind her eyes. Not anger, but purpose. Still writing about tyrants and thieves? The voice startled them both. Marcus Aelius stood beside the cart, his tavern slave tunic damp with sweat and splashed with wine stains. Despite his lowly station, his eyes sparked with intelligence. Vibia grinned, sliding the tablet behind her cloak in one fluid motion. Only the ones with names and titles. Marcus chuckled, then reached into his tunic, producing a small leather pouch that clinked softly. He handed it to Gaius. From the tavern, Marcus explained. They liked your bread today. Even the burnt bits. Gaius weighed the pouch in his palm, surprised. They've never sent coin before. They've never had leftovers that weren't stolen, Marcus replied with a shrug. Marcus squatted next to Vibia, lowering his voice to a near whisper. Lucius knows. He's been asking around about who writes the forum verses. You need to be careful. Vibia stiffened slightly, but continued etching words. Then I'll write faster, she muttered, stylus never pausing. Gaius exhaled heavily. You're both fools. Marcus pulled a wrapped fig from his tunic, tore it in half, and offered pieces to father and daughter. They accepted silently, the sweet fruit a momentary respite from the day's bitterness. 3 outcasts sharing stolen sweetness, bound by bread, ink, and shared misfortune. As darkness crept across the emptying forum, they hunched over the last good loaf Gaius had saved. No shouting, no haggling. Just warm bread passed between calloused hands and exchanged glances loaded with unspoken meaning, like rebels planning a war with nothing but crumbs for ammunition. Dawn broke over Pompeii with unusual fanfare. Hammers pounded rhythmically against wood as workers erected temporary platforms throughout the forum. Horn blasts punctuated the morning air, signaling the start of another workday. Men balanced on ladders hung garlands of fresh laurel and myrtle across archways, while others scrubbed decades of grime from statues of forgotten dignitaries. The Vulcanalia festival approached, Pompeii's tribute to Vulcan, god of fire and forge. The city transformed beneath nimble hands, old stones renewed under bright decorations. Gaius pushed his weathered cart through streets narrowed by construction. Red and gold banners fluttered overhead, snapping in the morning breeze like sails. Workers shouted to each other, their voices a jumbled chorus of excitement and frustration. Games start at midday, gladiators from Capua. A freckled boy darted between pedestrians, waving a painted announcement board. Fire dancers at sunset, sacrifices at dawn, prime seating for those with tokens. Gaius slowed as a cluster of well-dressed young men blocked his path. Their togas gleamed impossibly white against the dusty street. Father secured the corner stall by the fountain. The tallest youth's voice carried, deliberately loud. Prime location, best in the forum. Triple the traffic of last year. Gaius's hands tightened around his cart handle. That corner, his corner, 3 festivals ago. Before the special fees had tripled, before Lucius Faustus had rearranged the market hierarchy. The bakery entrance teemed with vendors arguing over time slots. A red-faced man waved a folded wax tablet at the doorkeeper. This gives me priority. See the seal? I paid for morning hours. Inside the pistrinum, heat blasted from stone ovens. Flour dust hung suspended in shafts of light. The assistant baker, a man with forearms thick as tree limbs, leaned toward Gaius as he measured flour. Festival week's crowded. You want early oven time? You pay early. He tapped the counter twice, eyes darting toward the back room. Gaius felt the meager weight of coins hidden in his belt. Barely enough for flour, not enough for bribes and ingredients both. Yet last year's festival had brought rare profit. 3 days of steady sales before everything spoiled in the heat. "I'll find the coin," he said, decision hardening his voice. At home, Vibia knelt beside their sleeping pallet, sliding a rolled parchment beneath the wooden bench. Her newest creation, a scathing verse titled "The Magistrate of Mold," that named Lucius directly. Her hand lingered over the scroll before pushing it deeper into shadow. When Gaius returned, his face bore deeper lines than when he'd left that morning. "I'm buying a better stall spot. For the festival." Vibia looked up sharply. "With what? Hope and crusts?" He offered no answer, just turned toward the window, where smoke from a priest's blessing drifted skyward from the forum stage. The crowd cheered as flames consumed the offering. In the distance, beyond the city walls, Mount Vesuvius released a faint, unfamiliar hiss. Gaius watched the spectacle briefly before slipping out again. At the forum wall, he studied the stall map with its wax seals marking claimed locations. His fingers traced the outline of a small corner spot. Not the best, but better than his usual place. He placed his palm over it, covering the space completely. "Not this year," he whispered. "Not again." Gaius loaded the last of his dough onto his cart when a shadow caught his eye. A dark plume of smoke curled into the sky, twisting above the rooftops like a malevolent serpent. Not from the mountain. This was closer, rising from the bakery district. Gaius abandoned his cart and hurried toward the pistrinum. The air around the bakery choked with ash and frantic shouts. Vendors pressed cloths against their faces, eyes watering. Inside, the back oven belched thick black smoke, flames leaping unnaturally high. Someone had dumped too much pine pitch into the fire, and now it burned with uncontrolled ferocity. The flue collapsed. A young apprentice burst through the doorway, face streaked with soot, coughing violently. His tunic was singed at the edges. "Master says." His words dissolved into another coughing fit. A scorched wooden paddle sailed through the doorway, clattering against the street stones. Inside, men shouted accusations, blame flying faster than the sparks. Gaius pushed his way through the crowd and spotted a boy huddled against the wall. Couldn't be more than 12. Probably a delivery runner. He clutched his right hand to his chest, the skin angry red and blistered. Tears cut clean tracks through the soot on his face. Everyone rushed past him, more concerned with saving their dough than the injured child. The head baker kicked over a water bucket, the precious liquid disappearing into the packed earth. "Every damn festival. Someone ruins the draft." He waved his arms wildly. "No more baking until the heat drops. Everyone out." Dozens of schedules destroyed with a single command. Vendors groaned, knowing their day's profits were evaporating like the spilled water. Gaius set down his dough sack and knelt beside the injured boy. He tore a strip from the bottom of his own tunic and wrapped it gently around the blistered hand. The boy flinched but didn't pull away. "Here." Gaius offered his water flask, the last of his morning ration. "Drink." The boy nodded gratefully, took a sip, then stumbled away into the crowd. When Gaius turned back, a heavy-set vendor had claimed his assigned oven slot. "That's my space," Gaius protested. The overseer barely glanced his way. "No proof. You weren't standing here." He turned away, deaf to further argument. Gaius clenched his fists, knuckles white with familiar powerlessness. Outside, more smoke billowed as the neighboring pistrinum joined the chaos, its chimney belching black fumes. "Bad omens," whispered an old woman, clutching her amulet. "First the tremors, now this." She pointed toward Vesuvius, looming silent but watchful over their troubled city. Vibia appeared at his side, her expression softening when she saw his defeated posture against the wall. She pressed a small leather pouch into his palm. "From the scribe's boy," she said. "Extra payment for a second scroll." Gaius felt the weight of salt, rare and valuable, inside the pouch. His hands trembled with rage and fatigue as he tucked it carefully into his belt. Smoke in the ovens, smoke in the sky. He gestured toward the mountain. "If this city's trying to burn us out, it's doing a fine job." Gaius stood before the bakery's overseer, shoulders rigid with tension. The charred scent of scorched flour hung in the air, a constant reminder of the day's chaos. He clutched his small pouch tightly, knuckles white. Behind him, a restless queue of vendors jostled and muttered, each desperate for oven time before the Vulcanalia festival began. The overseer lounged against his stool, arms folded across his chest. His eyes flicked over Gaius with practiced disinterest. "I've already filled most of tomorrow's list." He tapped a wax tablet with his stylus. "Unless, of course, you're willing to make it worth my while." Gaius swallowed hard. He'd heard those words before, spoken with that same casual cruelty. Slowly, he loosened the drawstring on his belt pouch and extracted a small coin. The metal caught the fading light as he held it, feeling its weight in his palm. This wasn't just metal. This was flour for tomorrow, oil for the lamps, firewood for the hearth when Vibia stayed up late with her writing. His fingers tightened around it momentarily before he slid it across the rough wooden table with forced nonchalance. The overseer's eyebrow arched upward, unimpressed. Gaius hesitated, then added a second coin beside the first. The overseer's face transformed, lips curling into a smile that never reached his eyes. He scratched Gaius's name near the top of tomorrow's oven list. "Early morning, don't be late." Relief washed through Gaius as he turned away. One good spot might recoup what he'd just spent. A heavy-set vendor stepped forward, brushing past Gaius with a shoulder that was more shove than accident. The man slapped a bulging leather pouch onto the table. Coins clinked inside, far more than Gaius's meager offering. The overseer's eyes lit up. His stylus moved quickly across the wax, striking through Gaius's name and rewriting it much further down the list. He barely bothered hiding the move. Gaius stopped mid-step. His mouth opened, words of protest forming on his tongue. Then he looked at the vendor's fine tunic, the gold ring on his finger. The words died unspoken. Gaius closed his mouth. What was the point? Challenge it, and he'd lose the slot entirely. Outside, he leaned against a wall, staring down at his empty pouch. One coin remained. One. Enough for a handful of barley or a cracked jug of cheap wine. Not both. Two vendors strolled past, laughing together like conspirators. Gaius recognized one, a patrician's son playing at merchant for sport. "Quintus got me fast-track firewood for just 5 denarii, one boasted. "This festival's just another market for bribes," his companion replied with a chuckle. A mangy dog gnawed at a discarded bread crust near the alley drain. As Gaius watched, another dog approached, eyes hungry. The first dog snarled, hackles rising. Gaius didn't move to intervene. It was how things worked here. The strong stole and the rest starved or smiled through gritted teeth. He walked home slower than usual, each step weighted with resignation. Tomorrow he'd have a chance to bake. Later than promised, but still something. The opportunity had cost him his dignity, his family's food, and any remaining faith in a system that kept selling the same hollow promises to the same desperate people. Lucius Faustus sat alone in his shaded office, rereading a copy of the Forum poem. Slender fingers traced the lines of dark ink, each word more clever and scathing than the last. He tapped his stylus against the scroll, jaw tight with contained fury. Men who measure grain with crooked scales will find their souls weighed true in Hades. The words mocked him from the parchment. The door creaked open. His clerk entered, arms laden with a bundle of confiscated street writings. "More verses, sir. This one was posted near the baths, and this left under a statue of Minerva." Lucius flipped through them, eyes narrowing as he scanned each scrap. More attacks on grain officials, thinly veiled references to rats in fine tunics and wolves who guard the wheat fields. The handwriting varied, but several shared a distinctive style. "Wait," he paused, finger pressed against a peculiar quirk in the script. The way the letter R curled at the tail, elegant yet defiant. The spacing between lines perfectly measured. He'd seen this hand before, not on walls, but on a receipt. He pushed back from his desk and strode to the filing cabinet, digging through a stack of vendor permits and fines. His fingers moved quickly, ignoring the parchment dust and wax flakes that clung to his manicured nails. Halfway through the stack, his hand stopped. There it was. A scroll Gaius Crispus had submitted months ago. A formal request for market space, but the handwriting wasn't the bread seller's crude scrawl. This was filed in a finer hand. Lucius unrolled it and laid it beside the poem, comparing the script side by side. Same R, same spacing, a slight nick in the stylus that left a tiny tail mark on vertical strokes. His eyes glinted with cold satisfaction. "Crispus's girl," he muttered, recalling her presence at the market disputes. The sharpness in her words when she defended her father. The unexpected eloquence from a bread vendor's daughter. It all fit together like pieces of a mosaic. He called in his assistant with a sharp snap of his fingers. "Begin monitoring the daughter. No arrest, not yet, just eyes. If she posts again, I want the parchment and the witness." "She's just a bread girl," his assistant offered weakly, shifting his weight from one foot to another. Lucius didn't look up as he arranged the evidence before him. Bread doesn't threaten Rome, but stories burn. When he was alone again, Lucius drafted a falsified inspection order marking Gaius's stall for random audit on festival day. A pretext, if needed. Insurance against further trouble. As he pressed his seal into the hot wax, a small tremor shook the table. An inkwell wobbled dangerously near the edge. Lucius steadied it with a finger, unfazed by the rumbling beneath his feet. "Let them worry about the mountain," he murmured, eyes fixed on the drying document. "I'll handle the city." Gaius arranged his loaves in tidy rows, separating the darker crusts from the golden ones. The morning crowd ebbed and flowed around his stall, coins clinking in pouches, voices haggling over prices. He worked methodically, fingers calloused from years of kneading and hauling. A shadow fell across his display. Gaius looked up. Lucius Faustus stood before him, arms clasped behind his back, wearing the smile of a predator. No clipboard, no assistant, just Lucius, alone and unnervingly calm. Gaius's hands froze mid-motion, his spine straightened like a rod had replaced it. This wasn't routine. The official's posture was too relaxed, his gaze too focused. Nearby, shoppers pretended absorption in their errands, but their conversations quieted. Eyes darted sideways. Everyone knew what Lucius represented. "Relax, Crispus," Lucius said softly. "I'm not here for fines today." He lifted a loaf from the front row, turning it in his hands as if appraising a jewel. Still dense, but charming in its way. Gaius remained silent. Years of navigating Pompeii's bureaucracy had taught him that words often became weapons in the wrong ears. He watched, waited, muscles tense beneath his worn tunic. Lucius leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a pitch that wouldn't carry beyond their stall. It's a shame about anonymous poetry cluttering up the city. Clever stuff, sharp too, almost too clever for a mere vendor. Gaius's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed. The message wasn't subtle. Lucius didn't need evidence, just suspicion. This wasn't an accusation, it was a warning wrapped in honeyed condescension. "If I were you," Lucius continued, placing the loaf back with exaggerated care, "I'd keep my household focused on baking, not writing." His fingers lingered on the crust, delicate as if handling glass. The threat landed harder than a blow. Gaius finally spoke, voice quiet but firm. "My household works to survive. We don't have time for poems." Lucius's lips curved upward. He turned to leave, tunic swishing against the wooden stall. "Well said, and let's hope it stays that way." He paused, glancing back over his shoulder. The forums crowded during festivals. Accidents happen. Only after Lucius disappeared into the throng did Gaius exhale. He wiped his flour-dusted hands on his tunic, leaving white streaks across the faded fabric. His eyes scanned the square frantically, searching for Vibia's slender figure among the market-goers. His heart hammered against his ribs. The message couldn't have been clearer. Keep her quiet, or someone else will. Gaius burst through the door of their apartment, slamming it behind him. A cloud of street dust swirled in his wake, dancing in the late afternoon light that filtered through their small window. He threw his apron onto the bench with such force that flour puffed up in a white cloud. His jaw clenched tight, chest heaving with each breath. Vibia looked up from her writing, startled by the noise. She was mid-stanza, the ink still wet and glistening on the papyrus. Her arm moved instinctively to cover the words beneath. "What happened?" Gaius didn't answer right away. He paced the cramped space, 3 steps one way, 3 steps back, rubbing the back of his neck with calloused fingers. Muttered curses escaped his lips as his boots scuffed against the cracked tile floor, each step punctuating his agitation. "He came to the stall," Gaius finally said, words sharp as flint. Vibia's expression tightened. Her fingers curled around the edge of her papyrus. "Lucius?" Gaius turned to her, fury rising in his face like heat from an oven. "He knows, Vibia, or thinks he does. He said accidents happen. You think your words are clever. You think they're safe." Vibia stood, arms crossed over her chest, chin lifted in defiance. "I'm not the one who's afraid of him. You pay bribes, you bow your head. And for what? To sell bread that barely feeds us?" Gaius slammed his fist onto the table, sending the inkpot clattering across the surface. Black liquid splashed onto the floor like blood. "We don't have the luxury to fight back. We survive, that's what we do. Because if we don't, we're crushed. And what kind of life is this, Father?" Vibia's voice cracked, with anger, not fear. Her hands shook at her sides. "You survive one day at a time and call it living. I want more than dust and crusts." The two glared at each other in heavy silence. The air between them thickened, not just with anger, but years of compromise, of exhaustion, of unspoken grief. The small room seemed to shrink around them, walls closing in with each unspoken accusation. Gaius finally sank onto the bench, shoulders slumping forward. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "I already lost your mother to this city. I won't lose you too. Not for a poem." Vibia turned away, jaw clenched, eyes glassy with unshed tears. But she didn't respond. Gaius set out early, his cart half loaded with the day's first batch. The streets remained shadowed by dawn, buildings cutting black silhouettes against the purpling sky. He'd left without waking Vibia. Better that way after last night's words still hung between them like smoke. His shoulders ached from the familiar weight of the cart straps, but he welcomed the pain. It anchored him. He chose the quieter side alleys, avoiding the forum's morning bustle. The silence wrapped around him like a threadbare cloak, uncomfortable but necessary. Only his footsteps and the creak of wooden wheels marked his passage. Through the sleeping city. A dry breeze swept down the narrow passage, carrying the smell of animal sweat and old hay. Gaius wrinkled his nose as he rounded the corner near the stable rows. The smell grew stronger, sharper, Then he saw it. A mule collapsed beside a leaking water trough, legs folded unnaturally beneath its body. The animal was emaciated, ribs pressing against dull hide like the ridges of a washboard. Its breath came in ragged gasps that barely moved its sunken flanks. A broken harness lay beside it, leather straps frayed and snapped. No owner in sight. Flies buzzed around its half-closed eyes, landing on crusted nostrils. The mule twitched but made no effort to rise. Gaius looked around. A pottery vendor walked past, glancing at the animal before hurrying on. Two women with baskets stepped wide around it, covering their noses. A boy no older than 10 tossed a pebble that bounced off the mule's flank, laughing as he ran away. No one stopped. No one cared. Something in Gaius snapped. He stood frozen, watching the mule's suffering reflected back at him like still water. Without thinking, he reached into his satchel and pulled out a nearly fresh heel of bread. It wasn't much. He'd been saving it to sell later, but he crouched beside the mule and held it to its muzzle. The mule struggled to lift its head, nostrils flaring weakly at the scent of food. Its jaw worked slowly, eyes half closed as it managed to chew. For a moment, Gaius saw more than an animal. He saw himself, broken down and discarded, clinging to each day. "Waste of bread," scoffed a nearby vendor setting up his stall. "It'll be dead by noon." Gaius didn't respond. He stroked the mule's neck gently, feeling the bones beneath his palm. His brow furrowed, his silence louder than any retort. A temple bell rang in the distance, marking the hour. The sound broke through Gaius's reverie. He stood, wiped his hand on his tunic and adjusted the cart straps on his shoulders. The day wouldn't wait, even for dying things. As he walked away, he turned back one last time. The mule had stopped chewing. Its chest no longer rose and fell with labored breath. It lay still, half in shadow, half in sun, already becoming part of the street. "We all die in the dirt here," Gaius muttered under his breath. "The only difference is how many lashes we take first." Then he continued on to the forum, heavier than when he left. The forum's usual cacophony had been replaced by something worse, near silence. Gaius felt it immediately as he pulled his cart through the eastern entrance. Vendors huddled in tight clusters, voices barely above whispers. Several stalls stood half-assembled, their owners glancing nervously toward the temple steps. No flute players competed for coins, no children chased stray dogs between the columns. Vibia appeared from between two stalls, moving with purpose. Her face was drawn, eyes darting behind her as she reached his cart. "Inspectors," she whispered, gripping his arm. "3 of them, full patrol. They're fining everyone, weights, permits, even the fishmongers for the smell of their catch." Gaius exhaled slowly through his teeth. Today of all days. He rushed to make his humble display presentable, wiping ash from the morning's loaves with a rag, straightening the threadbare cloth beneath them. With practiced hands, he pushed several misshapen loaves under the cart, covering them with an empty sack. From across the forum, a wine seller's protest rose above the murmurs. An inspector in a pristine tunic measured the neck of an amphora with bronze calipers, his face impassive. "Diluted," the inspector declared. 2 denarii. "But the seal is intact. You can see—" The inspector's voice hardened. "Would you prefer I suspend your license entirely?" The wine seller's mouth snapped shut. He dug into his pouch with trembling fingers. Gaius watched a second inspector break away, heading directly toward his stall. Young, clean-shaven, with the awkward authority of someone new to power. He eyed Gaius's bread like a hawk studying wounded prey. "Weights?" The single word carried accusation. Gaius handed over his copper scale without comment. The inspector placed a sample loaf on it, watching the balance settle with narrowed eyes. The silence stretched between them like a bowstring pulled too tight. Borderline. The inspector's finger tapped the scale. "Were you shaving flour?" "No," Gaius replied, keeping his voice level. That's all honest grain." The inspector's stylus scratched across his wax tablet. He held it up. 1 denarius. "Inconsistent. Infractions noted this month." 2 stalls over, a commotion erupted. An old woman with weathered hands shouted as 2 inspectors confiscated her basket of olives. "These are fresh from my son's trees." "Fresh." "Rotten goods," one inspector declared. A small child clutched the woman's skirts, tears streaking his dirty face. The crowd watched, eyes downcast, nobody moving to help. Vibia's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "This isn't enforcement," she hissed through clenched teeth. "It's taxation without law." Gaius shot her a warning look, sharp enough to cut. Her words were dangerous, especially now. When the inspectors moved on, Gaius sighed and fished his last silver coin from his belt pouch. His entire day's profit gone before the sun had climbed halfway to its zenith. Around him, vendors muttered curses to the gods, to the city, to their own ill fortune, then turned back to their stalls and continued selling anyway. What else could they do? Dawn crept over Pompeii beneath a strange gray haze. The sun, normally a fierce golden disk by this hour, appeared muted and distant, a pale ghost of itself struggling to pierce the smoky veil that hung over the city. Light filtered weakly through the haze, casting everything in a dull, shadowless glow. Gaius woke to a familiar scratching in his throat. He pushed himself upright, joints protesting, and squinted at the windowsill. A fine layer of powder coated the wood, delicate as fresh flour but wrong in color, ashen gray instead of wheat white. He ran his fingertips through it, rubbing the substance between them, too soft for soot, too fine for dust. The particles clung to his skin with strange persistence. Volcanic ash, fresh from the mountain. Outside, neighbors swept their stoops with grim determination. Brooms raised small clouds that settled again moments later, rendering the effort pointless. "Third morning this week," muttered Cassius, the cobbler, attacking his doorstep with a worn broom. "Something's burning somewhere." "It's not fire," replied the fruit seller's wife, voice hushed as though speaking a forbidden truth. "It's the mountain. Vesuvius is restless." The baker from the corner shop shuffled past, his usual morning greeting interrupted by a racking cough that bent him double. By the time Gaius reached the forum, every surface wore the same grey coat. He arrived earlier than usual, hoping to make up yesterday's losses, and found the stalls looking like abandoned ruins, ghostly and still beneath their powdery blanket. Each movement sent clouds puffing upward. He wiped his bread display with a damp rag, leaving streaks of grey water that dried almost immediately. Vibia appeared an hour later, a cloth wrapped tightly around her face. Her eyes, the only visible part of her, darted frequently toward the obscured sky. "It wasn't like this yesterday," she said, pulling the cloth down briefly to speak. "It's getting thicker." Gaius nodded, watching a customer hurry away after a hasty purchase. The usual crowd had thinned dramatically. Those who came moved with purpose. No lingering, no haggling, no gossip exchanged between. Stalls. They grabbed necessities and departed quickly, as though the air itself made them uneasy. Vibia continued. "The spice trader says his suppliers from Naples never arrived. They're stuck inland, no carts getting through the mountain pass. Prices are already climbing." Across the way, Gaius watched Titus, the vendor who'd accused him of theft during the mule incident, mixing something into his dough. The man glanced furtively around before tipping a sack of gray-brown flour into his usual wheat. Cheaper stuff. Filler. A sudden gust swept across the forum, sending a spiral of ash dancing through the square. People turned away, shielding their faces. A child near the fountain doubled over in a violent coughing fit. His mother pulled him close, eyes wide with fear. "It's the gods," spat an old man nearby. "They're angry." Gaius turned toward the northeast, where Vesuvius should have dominated the horizon. The mountain was barely visible through the haze, a dark shape looming in silence. Something cold settled in his stomach as he studied it. "No," he whispered, almost without realizing. "She's not angry yet, just clearing her throat." Vibia hunched over their small table, squinting at the legal text. Her fingers, stained black with ink, traced each Latin phrase with methodical precision. The night was far spent, yet she'd been working since before dawn, racing to complete the copy before tomorrow's deadline. Outside, ash continued to fall, coating everything with its ghostly shroud. Inside, the candle flame wavered oddly, casting elongated shadows that danced across the walls like restless spirits. A sharp knock at the door made her jolt, spattering ink across the final paragraph. Vibia cursed under her breath. Visitors at this hour were rare, especially with the strange weather keeping most people indoors. Gaius looked up from the broken wheel he was repairing, his weathered hands freezing mid-motion. His eyes narrowed with immediate suspicion. "Were you expecting someone?" he whispered. Before she could answer, he grabbed the bread knife and moved toward the door. When he pulled it open, Darius stood on their threshold, the scribe's son looking immaculate despite the ashen air. His upper tunic remained crisp and spotless, his dark hair gleaming with oil. In one hand, he held an ornate scroll case. In the other, a small sealed leather pouch. "Your copies were accurate," he announced, stepping inside without invitation. "My father's impressed with your work. The handwriting is exceptionally clean." Vibia felt a flush of pride despite herself. "Thank you." Darius handed her the scroll case, then hesitated, fingers lingering on the leather pouch. His eyes darted to Gaius, then back to her. "There's been talk," he said, a voice dropping, "about writing, dangerous writing." Vibia's pulse quickened. She slid her unfinished satire, a particularly scathing piece about Lucius Faustus and the grain inspectors, beneath her sleeve with practiced subtlety. Her face remained neutral as she forced a polite smile. "I only copy what I'm paid to. No poetry in law, is there?" Darius didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned closer, lowering his voice further. "My father heard Lucius Faustus was asking about a girl, literate, vendor class, good penmanship." His eyes fixed on hers. "That's rare." Gaius moved silently behind Vibia, arms folded across his chest. He said nothing, but his posture spoke volumes, a warning as clear as if he'd shouted. Darius stepped back, suddenly more cautious. "I just thought you should know. People like Lucius don't ask questions unless they already suspect something." "Thank you for the warning." Vibia nodded, her voice steady while her mind raced. "And for the work." As the boy left, she closed the door softly behind him, then, for the first time in weeks, slid the bolt into place. She returned to the table where her scroll lay open, the ink drying on the final line. Without hesitation, she reached for her half-finished satire, unfolded it carefully, and held it over the candle flame. The parchment curled, blackened, then ignited with a small whoosh. She watched her words disappear into ash. The forum pulsed with chaotic energy. Flute players warmed up near the temple steps, their melodies clashing with drummers practicing for the Vulcanalia procession. Workers stretched colorful banners between columns while vendors shouted louder than usual, each trying to outdo the next. Freshest figs, purest oil, finest fabric from Alexandria. The noise swelled like a living thing. Gaius trudged into this cacophony, shoulders hunched, sweat already darkening his tunic despite the early hour. Sleep had evaded him after another night spent fixing the cursed wheel on his cart. His joints ached. His eyes burned. When he reached his usual spot, he found Flaccus's elaborate canopy extended 2 feet into his space. The neighboring vendor pretended not to notice, arranging fancy bread loaves shaped like dolphins. "Your awning's in my space, Flaccus." Gaius shoved the wooden support pole back. Flaccus shrugged without looking up. "I didn't see your name carved here." Before Gaius could respond, a familiar voice cut through the marketplace din. Well, Crispus, late again." Lucius Faustus stood there, flanked by 2 assistants carrying wax tablets. His thin lips curved into what might have been a smile on anyone else. On him, it looked predatory. "Let's see what you're offering the good citizens today." Lucius picked up a loaf, turning it slowly as if examining a suspicious object. He poked it dramatically with his finger, then brought it to his nose, making an exaggerated sniffing motion. Burned on the outside, undercooked within. He clicked his tongue. Disappointing. Gaius clenched his jaw so tight his teeth might crack. Lucius continued his performance, inspecting each loaf with theatrical disgust. "These are unacceptable. I'm afraid that's another fine." He scribbled on his tablet. 4 denarii. The blood rushed to Gaius's face. 4. That's more than I'll make all day. Public quality standards. Section 8. Lucius tapped his stylus against the tablet with deliberate slowness. Bread unfit for the gods, unfit for the people. Something inside Gaius, something bent and compressed for years, finally snapped. He lunged forward, grabbing Lucius by his fine tunic, bunching the expensive fabric in his fist. "Enough," he growled through clenched teeth. "You feed on us like rats in a grain bin." The marketplace fell silent. A child dropped a fig with a soft thud. Vendors froze mid-transaction. Lucius didn't flinch. He merely raised one eyebrow, looking almost amused. Violence. In public, that's enough to revoke your license permanently, Crispus. Shall we call the guard? "Father, no!" Vibia appeared from nowhere, grabbing his arm and pulling him back. "They want you to snap," she whispered urgently. "That's how they win." Gaius released Lucius, his hands trembling with rage. His breath came in short bursts. Lucius smoothed his tunic with practiced indifference. "Be careful, bread man. Earth isn't the only thing that breaks when it's pushed too far." He turned and walked away, his assistants scurrying behind. The crowd quickly resumed their business, eyes averted, pretending nothing had happened, but everything had changed. Gaius felt it in his bones, in the trembling of his hands, in the hollow pit of his stomach. The mountain loomed in the distance, silent witness to it all. Night fell over Pompeii, like a heavy blanket, lanterns flickering along the forum's outer walls. The marketplace had emptied hours ago, vendors gone home to count meager earnings or drown sorrows in cheap wine. Only Gaius remained, pacing slowly beneath the torchlit colonnade, his sandals scraping against stone worn smooth by generations. He clutched a small leather pouch in his calloused hand, fingering its contents through the worn fabric. 4 denarii, his emergency savings. The exact amount Lucius had fined him earlier. The edge of one coin had worn thin from his thumb rubbing it all day, a nervous habit born of desperation. Gaius stopped outside a modest villa tucked behind an iron gate. Climbing vines obscured the property marker, but everyone knew this belonged to Maro, the oven coordinator's cousin. The whispers traveled fast through the marketplace. Maro controlled the back door list for the best store locations during the Vulcanalia festival, the spots that could make or break a vendor. He knocked softly on the wooden door. A moment later, a sleepy-eyed servant opened it, recognition dawning on his face. "The bread seller," he murmured, stepping aside. "Follow me." The servant led him through a narrow corridor into a smoky courtyard where Maro reclined on a cushioned bench. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows across walls decorated with crude hunting scenes. Maro sipped watered wine from a copper cup, eyes calculating as Gaius approached. "Bread man," Maro said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. I hear you want sunshine. He rolled the word on his tongue like something sweet. Sunshine, the spot at the forum's eastern edge where morning foot traffic was highest. Gaius nodded once, setting the leather pouch on the low table between them. The coins clinked softly against each other. I don't need favors, just space, a clean chance to sell. Maro picked up the pouch, weighing it in his hand with practiced nonchalance. He loosened the drawstring, peered inside, then set it aside without counting. Sunshine is expensive this week, he said coyly, swirling the wine in his cup. But your name's on the board, just don't ask to change it. Gaius nodded once, silent. He didn't thank Maro. He didn't speak at all. There was no dignity left to protect in the exchange, just necessity. Outside, the street felt colder, quieter. Gaius walked home empty-pocketed but determined. This stall would make or break him. One good day could stretch them through the winter, give Vibia the breathing room she needed, maybe even enough to replace the roof tiles before the autumn rain. As he passed a small shrine to Mercury, god of merchants and thieves, he paused. From his pocket, he withdrew a crust of bread and dropped a single crumb onto the altar stone. Not as an offering, but as a message. Let the gods watch, he whispered to the night. I'm done asking. The rusty hinges protested as Gaius pushed open the door to their small home. The room swam in amber shadows, a single oil lamp casting long fingers of light across the worn floorboards. Vibia sat hunched at their small table. Scrolls unfurled before her, ink-stained fingers gripping a stylus. She didn't look up immediately, but he saw the tension in her shoulders, the deliberate stillness of someone waiting. The door creaked shut behind him. Vibia's eyes flicked up, scanning his face with the practiced scrutiny of someone who'd learned to read between lines. Her gaze dropped to his belt, to the empty leather pouch that had held their last denarii that morning. You paid someone, she said flatly. Not a question. Gaius hung his cloak on the peg by the door, feeling the weight of her stare on his back. He couldn't face her just yet. It's done, he muttered, running a hand through his hair. I got us a spot for the festival. Prime traffic. We'll clear every loaf. Vibia stood abruptly, the parchment in her hand crackling like distant thunder. At what cost? That was the last of our coin. You gave it to a rat in silk for a stall that's not even guaranteed. It's better than starving. Gaius turned, finally meeting her gaze, his voice rising. Better than waiting for your poems to fix Pompeii. My words aren't supposed to fix it. They're supposed to expose it. Vibia's eyes blazed in the lamplight. You just keep feeding the fire that's burning us. Gaius slammed his palm against the table, rattling the ink jar. Black droplets spattered across her pristine scroll. I feed us, Vibia, every day. You write, you mock, you dream. But it's me who keeps your feet dry and your stomach full. The anger drained from her face, replaced by something that cut deeper. Disappointment. Her voice cracked with grief. You don't even see it, do you? You're fighting to stay in chains just because they're familiar. Silence fell between them, heavy as the ash that blanketed the city on windless days. Gaius's shoulders slumped. The truth of her words sank into him like a stone into water, leaving ripples he couldn't ignore. Vibia set down her scroll, hands trembling slightly. She walked toward the door, each step deliberate. At the threshold, she paused, her back to him, silhouetted against the night beyond. I won't stop writing, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. And I won't watch you drown in the dirt you refuse to escape. Then she was gone, the lamp flame dancing wildly in her wake, casting Gaius's shadow long and distorted against the wall. The temple of Mercury's atrium hummed with the anxious energy of festival preparations. Merchants clustered beneath soaring marble columns, their voices a nervous murmur beneath the sacred hymns that rose toward a sky tinted gray with ash. Priests moved between braziers, dropping incense that spiraled upward in fragrant clouds. The air felt thick with both devotion and calculation. Prayers for profit whispered alongside genuine pleas for divine protection. Vibia pressed herself against a column at the edge of the crowd. The plain brown cloak she wore helped her blend with the merchants' wives and daughters, but beneath it, her heart hammered against her ribs. The scroll in her hand felt heavy, the parchment warm from her grip. She'd rewritten it 3 times, perfecting every syllable, every rhythm. No more anonymous notes pinned to walls. No more hiding. The high priest raised his hands, calling for silence. The crowd hushed immediately, faces turning expectantly toward the altar. As the first prayer began, Vibia stepped forward. Her sandals whispered against marble as she moved past stunned traders. With each step, her resolve hardened. She climbed the side dais, not quite the altar itself, but elevated enough that every eye in the atrium snapped toward her in confusion. Vibia unrolled her parchment with steady hands. When she spoke, she didn't shout. She simply let her clear voice carry across the suddenly silent space. The ovens burn both bread and truth, while scales tip with gold's weight. Her words flowed in perfect meter, each line cutting through pretense. She spoke of grain taxed until stocks broke, of bribes kneaded into dough, of a city so drunk on its own perfumes it couldn't smell its rot. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some gasped at her audacity, others scoffed and turned away, but many grew still, leaning forward to catch every word. A pot seller lowered his tray to the floor. A young baker's apprentice with flour-dusted arms whispered to his companion, "She's talking about Faustus." Halfway through her recitation, the crowd parted. Lucius Faustus entered the atrium, then froze mid-stride. His eyes locked onto Vibia, then dropped to the parchment in her hands. Recognition dawned across his face, yet he made no move to stop her, no shout of outrage. He simply folded his arms across his chest, his expression darkening with each stanza like storm clouds gathering. Vibia's voice grew stronger, conviction lifting her words toward the temple ceiling. "You polish scales and find the weight, but bread can't rise through fear and hate." A few scattered hands clapped. Someone near the back cheered before being hastily silenced. The priest stepped forward, face flushed with embarrassment, gesturing for her to stop. But Vibia's eyes never left Lucius as she delivered her final line. "Let Mercury bless trade, but curse deceit." Lucius moved then, his steps measured and deliberate. "Clever," he said, voice silky with controlled anger. "But inciting unrest at a public temple." His gaze flicked meaningfully toward the temple guards, who shifted uncomfortably, hands moving to their belts. But something unexpected happened. The crowd didn't disperse. Instead, they closed ranks. Vendors, bakers, even the flustered priest stepped between Vibia and Lucius. Not with weapons drawn or fists raised, but with the simple power of their presence. No riot, no rebellion, just a wall of silence that spoke volumes. We heard her. Vibia lowered her scroll. The die was cast. The fuse was lit. The candlelight flickered across Lucius Faustus's chambers, casting long shadows that danced across walls adorned with expensive tapestries. He sat rigid at his desk, the grain ledger pushed aside to make room for more pressing matters. His fingers moved with practiced precision as he dipped the quill into black ink, letting excess droplets fall back into the well. The official scroll with Pompeii's municipal seal lay before him, pristine and portentous. His scribe stood nearby, shoulders tense, clutching a blank parchment and a small pot of red wax. The man's eyes remained fixed on the floor tiles, studying their patterns with unnatural intensity. "Name, Vibia Secunda," Lucius dictated, his voice flat and cold as marble. "Charges, sedition by way of anonymous public defamation. incitement of unrest through unlicensed writings. The scribe's stylus scratched against parchment. A bead of sweat traced the man's temple, but he kept his hand steady. Lucius paused, contemplating the ceiling beams for a moment before continuing. Recommendation: quiet detainment. No public posting. Arrest discretion left to the inspector's office. The scribe hesitated, then glanced up. She's not a known criminal, sir, just a vendor's girl. Lucius's eyes narrowed to slits. And Caesar was just a man with a knife wound. He leaned forward, shadows deepening across his face. Words have consequences, especially clever ones. The scribe ducked his head and finished the document. Lucius took it, rolled it tight, and held out his hand for the wax. With methodical care, he dripped 3 perfect circles onto the edge, then pressed his official seal ring into the soft red surface. The wax hardened quickly, bearing the unmistakable mark of bureaucratic authority. A messenger waited outside. Lucius handed him the sealed scroll. Deliver this to Inspector Basso at dawn. Tell him, quiet hands, no bruises, no spectacle. We want obedience, not martyrdom. After the door closed, Lucius poured himself a cup of spiced wine from a silver decanter. The liquid swirled dark and potent. He drank deeply, letting the warmth spread through his chest. From a small pouch, he withdrew a crumpled parchment. Vibia's latest poem taken from the wall near the baths. He carried it to the brazier and held it over the flames. The parchment blackened at the edges, then caught fire. Words curled into smoke as the paper crumpled, disintegrating into ash. The firelight painted his face in hellish orange as he whispered, "Let her write one more verse. One. It will be her last." Gaius pushed his cart through a narrow side street, heading back from a flower trader's stall. The wooden wheels caught on every crack and pebble, grinding against the uneven stones. The morning sun beat down with unusual harshness, baking his neck and shoulders. Something felt wrong about the air, too heavy, too still, like breathing through wet wool. A fine layer of ash coated the rooftops and gutters, pale gray against the terracotta tiles. He passed a group of children skipping stones into a cistern. Their game lacked the usual boisterous shouts and challenges. Instead, they played with muted voices, their laughter oddly cautious, as if afraid to disturb something. One boy, no more than 7, paused mid-throw and glanced nervously at the mountain looming in the distance. The ground shuddered beneath them, not violently, but undeniably. Stone walls creaked like old bones. A stack of clay jars toppled in a shop stall, shattering across the cobblestones. Gaius froze mid-step, his hand gripping the cart handle until his knuckles whitened. The tremor continued, seconds stretching uncomfortably long. A flock of pigeons exploded into the sky from the temple roof, wings beating frantically against the morning air. The street fell silent. Even the dogs stopped barking. It was a shared breath. That moment when Pompeii collectively listened, waiting. A vendor dropped a jar. It smashed against the stones. No one flinched. They were used to this. Minor tremors had become routine in recent weeks, barely worth commenting on anymore. But this one lasted just a little too long. People exchanged glances, quick and meaningful. Gaius looked toward Vesuvius. Nothing seemed unusual. No plume, no roar, just its massive shadow rising silently over the city, like a secret too big to speak. The mountain stood as it always had, indifferent to their concerns. A nearby potter shook his head and muttered, "Old girl stretching her legs again." Someone chuckled nervously. "She's just clearing her throat." But their eyes didn't match their words. Their gaze lingered too long on the mountain slopes. Gaius continued walking, slower now, wheels squeaking with each rotation. His back ached more than usual, the old injury flaring with each step. Every bump in the road felt sharper, more deliberate. His thoughts drifted to Vibia. Where was she right now? After their fight, she hadn't come home. The memory of her words still stung. At a bakery, people lined up earlier than usual, jostling for position. Word spread that traders might not come tomorrow. Again. Everyone bought what they could, just in case. Just in case of what? No one quite said. As Gaius passed the temple steps, he noticed a fine crack in the stone column. Hairline, almost invisible. He ran his fingers along it and pulled his hand back, dusted with grit. He didn't say a word, just exhaled through his nose, tight-lipped, and continued on his way. Pompeii woke with a fever. The streets hummed with life hours before sunrise, torches casting long shadows against ancient walls. Garlands of cypress and laurel hung between buildings, swaying in the pre-dawn breeze. Incense burned at every corner, its sweet smoke mingling with the scent of roasting meats and honey cakes. The city had transformed overnight, no longer just stone and plaster, but a living, breathing entity preparing to honor Vulcan, god of fire and forge. Gaius fastened the leather straps on his cart with trembling fingers. Sleep had eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, the ground seemed to shift beneath his bed, the memory of yesterday's quake still reverberating through his bones. His palms were slick with sweat despite the cool morning air. Today matters, he whispered to himself, tightening the final knot. Today changes everything. He pushed his cart through a narrow alleyway toward the forum, wheels squeaking against the cobblestones. The passage teemed with bodies, vendors with baskets balanced on their heads, musicians tuning flutes and lyres, priests in ceremonial robes. Children darted between legs, faces painted with red and gold symbols, their laughter rising above the din. A boy wearing a wooden Vulcan mask crashed into Gaius's cart, nearly toppling a stack of flatbreads. "Watch where you're running," Gaius called after him, but without malice. The city had a pulse today, frantic, festive, fragile. He emerged into the forum and paused, momentarily breathless. The morning sun spilled over the eastern rooftops, bathing the marble columns in golden light. There, near the eastern archway, was his stall, the prime location he'd sacrificed everything to secure. Clean space, visibility, foot traffic, worth every coin. Gaius arranged his wares with practiced efficiency, unrolling the cloth covering and placing each loaf in neat, tempting rows. The honeyed flatbreads glistened in the early light, sprinkled with sesame and anise. His hands moved from memory, each placement deliberate. Each loaf felt like a silent prayer, for profit, for peace, for Vibia. His eyes scanned the growing crowd. No sign of his daughter, not at her usual corner where she sometimes sat to write, not behind the shrine where she liked to watch people. Nothing. The knot in his stomach tightened. The first wave of customers flowed through the forum like water finding new channels. They bought quickly. Festival bread for family tables, decorative loaves for temple offerings, simple rolls for the games later. Coins clinked steadily into Gaius's collection bowl, a rhythm he hadn't heard in months. Across the open square, a group of officials in dark tunics arrived near the temple steps. They moved with purpose, clustered around a central figure, not celebrants, not worshippers. One unrolled a scroll, pointing to something written there. Gaius squinted against the sunlight, his chest suddenly heavy. A thunderous cheer erupted as the high priest ascended the temple steps and thrust a torch into the ceremonial pyre. Flames shot skyward, orange and gold against the blue morning. The crowd surged forward in collective awe. Gaius felt it then, beneath the sounds of celebration, beneath the weight of coin in his bowl. Something fundamental had shifted. The ground beneath Pompeii wasn't stable, never had been. He returned to his stall, tried to focus on the customers, on counting change. But his hands kept twitching, dropping coins, fumbling with bread. The loaves were selling faster than he'd hoped. Yet something was deeply wrong. Vibia was missing, the city celebrated, and the mountain that loomed over them all remained eerily, unnaturally silent. Vibia glided through Pompeii's back alleys, wrapped in a drab cloak the color of old ashes. Her face remained half hidden beneath the hood, a shadow among shadows. The bundle of scrolls pressed against her side felt heavier than their weight, wrapped in worn cloth that once covered their dinner table. Festival drums pounded from the Forum Plaza, but she moved in the opposite direction, each step carrying her away from celebration and toward risk. She paused at a corner, watching. A temple guard stood at his post near the Vulcanalia altar, but his attention had wandered to a group of dancers with bells on their ankles and flowers in their hair. Their swirling skirts hypnotized him. Vibia slipped past, her sandals making soft crunching sounds on the volcanic grit that perpetually coated Pompeii's stones. She kept her head down, moved with purpose, but not panic. The magistrate's archive building sat in the shadow of the basilica, squat and unadorned compared to its grand neighbor. Stone walls housed the city's memory, its laws, ledgers, and lies. Vibia scanned the entrance. No guards. The officials were at the ceremony, paying tribute to fire while she prepared to steal its secrets. Inside, stillness enveloped her. The air hung thick, with parchment dust and the metallic tang of old ink. Row upon row of wooden shelves stretched into shadowy corners, laden with scrolls in various states of yellowing. The smell reminded her of forgotten things, unread poems, unpaid debts, unspoken truths. She moved swiftly through the quiet, her fingers tracing shelf labels. She found the section marked Inspection Permits, Vendor Registry, and began scanning the neat rows. Lucius Faustus's name appeared everywhere, his flowing script marking dozens of documents with official seals. But she wasn't looking for his public face. She was hunting for his shadow. There it was, a leather-bound logbook with a misleading title. Inside, column after column of voluntary donations from vendors across Pompeii. Her father's name appeared 3 times, each entry marked with a small symbol she recognized from the grain sacks. Different grades, different prices, different levels of desperation. Enough to ruin Lucius if shown to the right people. She pulled a small scroll from her satchel, a carefully crafted fake delivery manifest she'd prepared the night before. She tucked it into the empty space, arranging it to look undisturbed. The librarian might not notice for days. The sound of footsteps froze her in place. Voices approached from the hallway, men laughing, the distinctive jingle of a coin purse. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Vibia ducked into a storage alcove, pressing herself against shelves of census records. Through a narrow crack, she watched 2 men pass. One wore the distinctive tunic of a city official. The other carried an inspector's tablet. Not Lucius, but his assistant. After the festival, the official said. A quiet arrest. No need to spoil the celebrations. The baker's daughter? The other asked. And her troublesome scrolls. When their footsteps faded, Vibia slipped out and fled down a side corridor, the stolen logbook pressed against her ribs like a second heart. Each breath came shallow and quick. Lucius wasn't just corrupt. He was coming for her tonight, but now she held the weapon that could cut him down first. Lucius Faustus stood beneath the marble portico, his shadow stretching across the sun-baked stones. Festival-goers swirled through the Forum in a blur of color and noise, but his eyes remained cold, calculating, cutting through the chaos with predatory focus. His assistant hovered at his elbow, voice low as he read from a wax tablet. 3 bakers fined for improper weights. 2 wine merchants warned about watered stock. The potter from the Eastern Quarter paid his assessment in full. Lucius tapped an impatient finger against his forearm. The girl. What about the baker's daughter? The assistant glanced up. She hasn't been seen at the stall. We've had eyes on it since dawn." "Then she's somewhere else she shouldn't be." Lucius pocketed the inspection log with practiced efficiency. His mouth curled into a sneer that never quite reached his eyes. "Come." He moved with purpose through the crowd, flanked by 2 men in civilian tunics, guards without insignia. No public spectacle today. The festival was too important. Too many important eyes watching. This needed to be handled with discretion. Halfway to the archives, Lucius paused. Gaius's new stall stood at the prime corner near the temple steps, the spot that had cost the baker everything he had. The location teemed with customers, but Gaius himself looked distracted, neck craning as he peered down side streets between transactions. Searching. Lucius felt a flicker of satisfaction. The father didn't know where his daughter was either. "This is what happens," he muttered as he continued on, his sandals crunching over the fine layer of volcanic dust that perpetually coated Pompeii's streets, when vermin think they're poets. At the entrance to the archive hall, a clerk intercepted him, face flushed, hands fluttering like startled birds. "Sir, there's been... I don't know how." The man swallowed hard. "A ledger is missing. The vendor registry. A girl with dark hair came in during the morning shift, claimed to be checking property boundaries for her father." Lucius shoved past him, storming into the log room. He scanned the shelves, immediately spotting the gap where his private records should have been. A scroll stuck out at an odd angle. He snatched it, unrolled it, found nothing but a meaningless list of olive oil deliveries. His fist crushed the parchment. "She took it," he growled, jaw tight with fury. "She knows where to strike." He turned to his assistant. "Alert the forum post. Shut down all exits near the basilica." His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "And find that girl. Now." As the men scattered to follow his orders, Lucius straightened his tunic with deliberate movements, adjusting the official sash across his chest. To the festival crowd, he was still a respected magistrate, a pillar of Pompeian society. But beneath that mask, his fingers twitched with urgency. He strode back toward the forum, purpose hardening his features. He didn't yet know where Vibia was hiding, but he knew she had something dangerous, and before the day ended, he intended to take it back, along with everything else she held dear. A deep, guttural rumble rolled through the earth, vibrating through stone and flesh alike. Not the familiar tremor that Pompeians brushed off with practiced indifference, but something primal and wrong. The forum's marble columns shuddered. Stall poles rattled like spears in battle. Wine jars danced across tables before shattering on the ground. The entire forum froze mid-breath. The flute player's melody died in his throat. A priestess's prayer transformed into a strangled gasp. Children clutched at their mothers' tunics, wailing. The normal din of commerce evaporated, replaced by a terrible silence beneath the growing roar. A violent crack split the air, stone against stone, earth against sky, like the world itself had fractured. In the distance, one of the communal bakery's massive chimneys collapsed, sending a plume of black smoke spiraling upward. Across the street, terracotta tiles slid from a wealthy merchant's roof, crashing into the street with a sound of broken pottery. At his premium stall, Gaius lurched forward as the ground bucked beneath him. His tray of festival loaves, the ones that had cost him everything, tumbled from his grasp. The cart rocked violently on its wheels. He grabbed the wooden frame, knuckles white, as customers scattered in panic. His gaze snapped toward the magistrate's offices where Vibia had disappeared hours earlier. Inside the archive room, Vibia clutched the stolen scroll to her chest, its edges digging into her flesh. Dust rained from the ceiling as the floor pitched beneath her feet. A heavy marble ceiling tile crashed to the ground just inches from where she stood, shattering into deadly shards. She ducked low and bolted for the exit, heart hammering against her ribs. Outside, A massive plume of ash and smoke erupted from Mount Vesuvius, punching skyward like Jupiter's fist. The dark column rose higher than any cloud, spreading at its peak like a monstrous pine tree. Birds scattered in chaotic patterns, their instincts screaming what humans had yet to understand. Lucius Faustus, still in the forum, tilted his head skyward. The color drained from his face. For one suspended moment, he wasn't a corrupt official, but simply a man, small and fragile beneath nature's fury. His ledgers and schemes suddenly meaningless. Ash began to fall, delicate at first, like dirty snowflakes drifting from an impossible winter. Screams rippled through the crowd as realization dawned. "It's the gods!" someone shouted. "Run to the sea!" cried another. The orderly festival dissolved into chaos. Near Gaius, a bronze statue of Vulcan, god of fire and forge, tilted on its pedestal before crashing onto a merchant's table. Its heavy hand landed where Gaius had stood moments before. He stumbled backward, eyes wide, suddenly understanding that today's disaster had nothing to do with stall positions or bread prices. "Vibia!" he shouted into the panicked crowd, his voice swallowed by the roar of fear and falling ash. The mountain that had loomed over Pompeii all his life had awakened, hungry. Gaius shoved his way through the stampeding crowd toward the temple steps, bread and bribes forgotten. Nothing mattered now but finding his daughter. The sky above Pompeii transformed from blue to nightmare. A monstrous cloud churned overhead, swirling with ash and fire, no longer just a distant column, but a spreading canopy of doom. The mountain's fury grew darker by the heartbeat, pitch black at its base where it spewed from Vesuvius, edges glowing orange like the rim of Vulcan's forge. In the distance, flaming rocks arced through the air, crashing into rooftops and streets with thunderous impacts. Gaius pushed against the human tide, swimming upstream through panic. Bodies slammed against him from all directions as the crowd surged away from the forum. A merchant's cart overturned, spilling wine amphoras that shattered across the cobblestones. A terrified mule broke free from its handler, eyes wild with fear, and Gaius barely dodged its frantic charge by gripping a stone column. "Vibia!" His voice was lost in the cacophony of screams. His gaze fell on his abandoned bread stall. The premium spot he'd sacrificed everything for stood empty now, his carefully crafted loaves scattered and trampled in the dirt. One honey-glazed festival loaf, the specialty he'd stayed up all night perfecting, smoldered where a burning ember had landed on its crust. For a heartbeat, Gaius paused. His hands twitched toward the overturned crate where he kept the day's earnings. A few coins, perhaps the flour sack, something salvageable from this life he'd built, loaf by miserable loaf. But his body refused to move toward it. His ears strained instead, listening for her voice amid the chaos. The ground buckled beneath his feet, a violent convulsion stronger than the last. The marble fountain in the forum's center split with a crack like thunder. Terracotta tiles rained down, shattering against stone. The massive statue of Juno that had stood watch over the bathhouse for generations tipped with agonizing slowness before crashing into the courtyard below, sending marble fragments flying like deadly projectiles. Ash fell heavier now, no longer just flakes, but a suffocating blizzard. It coated Gaius's skin, burned his throat, stung his eyes until tears carved tracks down his soot-blackened face. He tore a strip from his tunic, tying it across his nose and mouth. Through the thickening haze, he scanned desperately for any sign of his daughter. A woman stumbled past, clutching an infant to her chest. Both were gray with ash, the baby's cries muffled against its mother's body. "The sea is blocked!" she screamed at Gaius, though he barely heard her through the cloth and roar of destruction. Nearby, a soldier helped children through a collapsing archway, his training holding firm even as the world crumbled. No one searched. Everyone simply ran. Gaius turned sharply toward the magistrate district. Vibia's final words echoed in his mind, her plan, her determination to expose Lucius. She wouldn't have fled without completing what she'd risked everything for. She was too much like him, stubborn beyond reason. A massive chunk of flaming debris struck the forum's tiled roof. The structure exploded outward in a shower of sparks and burning fragments. New fires bloomed where they landed, joining dozens already burning throughout the square. The air thickened with heat and cinders, swirling like a blizzard from the underworld itself. Gaius ran straight into the storm, eyes burning, each breath shallower than the last. "Vibia!" His voice cracked as he shouted her name again and again, the sound swallowed by the mountain's fury. But he didn't stop. None of it mattered anymore. Not the bread, not the stall, not the bribes or fines or daily humiliations. This day was never about survival through compliance. It was about finding her and getting out alive. Gaius reached the edge of the basilica square, his lungs burning with each desperate gulp of air. The ash clung to him like a second skin, his once beige tunic now blackened with soot and sweat. His legs trembled beneath him, muscles screaming from pushing against the human tide that fled in the opposite direction. Every step felt like wading through the thick mud. He staggered under a stone archway, bracing himself against the ancient blocks as another tremor rippled through the ground. Through stinging eyes, he surveyed the apocalyptic scene. To his left, the forum, his entire livelihood, lay in ruins. Flames devoured wooden stalls, coins and trampled bread scattered in muddy ash. To his right stretched the narrow alleyway that led toward home and the magistrate's offices, where Vibia might still be. Behind him, a thunderous crack split the air as the bakery's roof finally surrendered. Timbers crashed down, sending a geyser of sparks spiraling skyward. The blaze found new fuel in a nearby cloth merchant's abandoned wares. The colorful fabrics that had decorated festival mornings now fed the inferno. Fresh screams pierced the roar of destruction. Gaius looked down at his hands. Tools that had shaped dough since boyhood. They were cracked and burned, trembling uncontrollably. The leather pouch at his waist still held the morning's meager earnings. Everything else, the cart his father had helped him build, the recipes passed down 3 generations, the reputation built loaf by miserable loaf. All meaningless now. A vendor he recognized from the next row staggered past, clutching a crate of scorched bread to his chest like a precious child. "The docks! Run to the sea!" The man's face was a mask of terror. "Ships are taking anyone who can pay." Freedom beckoned. The harbor meant escape from this hellish trap, from the daily grind of poverty, from Lucius and his endless extortion. No more fines, no more bribes, no more scraping by. Just clean sky and a chance to begin again. Gaius took one halting step toward the escape route. His foot froze mid-stride. There, half buried in ash, lay a scrap of red fabric. A ribbon, frayed at one edge where Vibia had caught it on a nail last month. The ribbon she'd worn every day since her mother died. The mountain roared again, a sound so primal it seemed to crack the foundations of the earth itself. Pebbles danced across the ground as the tremor built. A fresh wave of ash poured from the sky like gray rain, coating everything in seconds. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe. Gaius clenched his jaw, his heart hammering against his ribs. The choice crystallized with perfect clarity. Bread was gone. Business was gone. The daily humiliations and small victories that had defined his existence, all swept away in fire and ash. Only one thing remained that mattered. He pulled the coin pouch from his belt and hurled it into a broken cistern. The splash was lost beneath the mountain's fury. Then he turned toward the chaos, drawing a final deep breath before plunging back into the smoke-filled streets. Vibia! The name tore from his throat with everything he had left. As Gaius disappeared into the ash-choked alleyways, the basilica's columns stood witness. The stalls burned, the forum crumbled. But one man still ran, not for profit, not for bread, but for his daughter. Lucius stumbled through the side corridor of the magistrate's hall, coughing violently as ash seeped through every crack and crevice. Scrolls swirled through the air like birds with broken wings, official records of taxes and censuses scattering in the chaos. His once pristine robes, symbol of his authority, were stained with soot that no fuller would ever be able to remove. He clutched a satchel bulging with ledgers and bribe records against his chest. The leather bag contained everything: names, payments, falsified fines, enough evidence to sink him if exposed. Years of careful extortion documented in his own meticulous hand. He gritted his teeth and tightened his grip on the damning evidence. The wealth these papers had brought him meant nothing now, but the danger they posed remained. A violent tremor knocked him off balance. The marble floor buckled beneath his feet like ocean waves. A bust of Emperor Vespasian toppled from its pedestal and smashed beside him, fragments of stone scattering across the floor. Dust exploded upward in a choking cloud. Lucius scrambled up, knees bruised, pride wounded worse than his body. He heard guards yelling from outside, their voices thin with terror. "Seal the temple doors. Leave it. Just run." The disciplined men who had enforced his will now abandoned their posts. Panic was setting in. Orders meant nothing now. The city was turning to chaos. Lucius tried the eastern exit, only to find it blocked by fallen masonry. Smoke and flame poured through the cracks in the wall, dancing like vengeful spirits. He shielded his face with his cloak and staggered back, coughing, swearing under his breath. The gods themselves had turned against him. He ducked into a side office to escape falling debris. Inside, scrolls were already on fire, the precious records of Pompeii's governance turning to ash. He kicked one aside, then slipped on ash-coated tile and crashed hard into a desk, cutting his hand on a bronze stylus. Blood ran down his wrist, mixing with black dust in grotesque patterns. He tore a strip from his robe to bind the wound, hissing in pain. His satchel remained clutched under his arm like a lifeline, the only thing that mattered now. The ceiling groaned, then part of it collapsed with a thunderous crack. A stone beam crashed through the office roof, striking Lucius's shoulder and pinning him halfway beneath a wooden desk. The impact drove the air from his lungs. He screamed in agony, struggling to pull free. The satchel fell from his grasp. He reached for it, fingers stretching desperately, but his fingers slipped, just out of reach, papers spilling like secrets across the floor. The evidence of his corruption lay exposed in the flickering light. Alone now, trapped and coughing, Lucius stared up at the cracking ceiling. Ash rained gently down, covering him in a shroud of gray. He murmured to no one. I kept the city fed. I balanced the scales. And then, silence as the dust thickened and the world dimmed around the man who had measured bread, but never justice. Gaius stumbled down a debris-strewn alley, coughing into his sleeve. The air hung thick and gritty, stinging his eyes and coating his throat. Every building, every cart, every statue stood cloaked in grey ash, like ghosts of themselves. He paused at a crossroads, lungs burning. "Vibia!" His voice came out hoarse, barely audible above the distant rumble. The name tore from his throat again, stronger this time. Vibia. A collapsed vendor stall blocked his path, wood splintered and awning torn. He climbed over it, foot slipping on a shattered amphora. The jagged edge sliced his palm. Blood mixed with ash on his skin as he gritted his teeth and pushed forward. Pain meant nothing now. Only finding her mattered. In the distance, a faint voice cried out, muffled by the storm. Gaius froze, heart racing wildly in his chest. Vibia. He strained to hear, but only another deep rumble from the mountain answered him. Still, he turned toward where he thought the sound had come from, limping faster now. He found her near the temple steps, doubled over coughing, a cloak pulled over her head for protection. She limped toward him, one sandal missing, her bare foot bloodied. Scrolls were clutched tight against her chest, their edges singed. Her face, streaked with tears and ash, lifted at the sight of him. For a heartbeat, they just stared at each other, stunned, breathless, as if neither believed the other was real. Then he rushed forward, pulling her into a fierce embrace. She clung to him, crying openly now, her body shaking against his. "I thought you were gone," she choked out between sobs, fingers digging into his back. Gaius didn't answer right away, just buried his face in her hair, gripping her like she was all that remained in the world. Because in that moment, she was. "I got the scroll," she said finally, holding it up between them. The parchment was smudged but intact. "It proves everything, every bribe, every fake inspection." Gaius took it, glanced at it briefly, and nodded. Not for justice, but because it had given her reason to live, to keep fighting, to survive until he found her. The ground shook again, harder this time. A statue of Mercury nearby crumbled, its head smashing onto the steps. Gaius grabbed her hand. "We have to move. Now." They began running through the smoke, supporting each other when one stumbled. Step by step, they headed toward the southern gate, dodging rubble and fallen awnings, eyes half closed against the ash. Her hand felt small in his, but her grip was strong. As they disappeared into the haze together, the temple behind them collapsed in a roar of stone and fire. Neither of them looked back. The only direction left was forward, through the ash, toward whatever came next. Their city was dying, but they were not. They reached the edge of the forum, lungs raw from coughing, legs weak from running. The eastern colonnade stood partially intact, its pillars framing a scene of pure chaos. Bodies pressed against them from all sides, men carrying children, women clutching household gods, animals braying in terror. The air thickened with screams and prayers. Gaius pulled Vibia against a column, giving them a moment to breathe. Through gaps in the billowing smoke, he caught sight of something familiar, his stall, his pride. The cloth canopy he'd haggled over for weeks now danced with orange flames. His wooden cart lay overturned, one wheel spinning lazily in the hot wind. The loaves, this morning's work, lay scattered across the stones, blackening to cinders beneath the heat. His feet moved before his mind could stop them. One step, then another. "Father!" Vibia's voice cracked behind him. Gaius didn't answer. He stood transfixed, watching years of his life dissolve into the haze. Every dawn he'd risen, every coin he'd scraped together, every inspection he'd endured, every humiliation, all turning to smoke before his eyes. Vibia tugged at his sleeve. Cloth pulled over her mouth. "Leave it," she urged, voice muffled beneath the fabric. "It's gone. We have to go." Her fingers dug into his arm, desperate and insistent. Still, he couldn't move. Not yet. His feet carried him forward as if drawn by some invisible thread. He bent down, fingers closing around a blackened paddle, the one his wife had carved patterns into before the fever took her. The wood felt warm, familiar in his palm. For a heartbeat he held it, thumb tracing the scorched spiral design. Then he let it fall. A flaming timber crashed down nearby, striking stone with a crack that jolted him back to reality. Heat pushed against them like a living thing. Gaius spun around, shielding Vibia with his body as sparks swirled past them in a burning dance. Behind them, with a groan of surrender, the stall collapsed completely. Wood splintered, coals hissed, and the last remnant of their livelihood vanished in seconds. A final offering to a city that had never given back what it took. Gaius's lips pressed into a tight line, his eyes rimmed with tears he refused to shed. Vibia glanced up at him, recognizing the grief in the set of his jaw, not just for bread and wood, but for years spent clinging to scraps of dignity that Pompeii had never valued. They moved forward again, hand in hand, through smoke and falling ash, past the ruins of temples they'd once prayed in, past crumbling statues of gods who'd abandoned them, past cracked mosaics that had told stories of heroes and monsters, stories less terrifying than the one they now lived. Neither looked back again. The city, the stall, the past, all buried now. What mattered was ahead, and still alive. They joined the river of humanity flowing toward the southern gate, swept along by panic and survival instinct. The road buckled beneath their feet, packed with overloaded carts, braying donkeys, and barefoot children stumbling in the ash. Names echoed through the chaos, mothers calling for sons, husbands searching for wives. Grey flakes fell steadily, coating hair and shoulders like a mockery of winter. "Marcella! Marcella!" A woman spun in desperate circles, eyes wild. Each breath scorched Gaius's lungs. The air hung thick with sulfur and heat, parching his throat with every gasp. Beside him, Vibia doubled over in a violent coughing fit, her small frame shaking. Without hesitation, Gaius pulled a damp cloth from beneath his tunic, his morning sweat rag, now reeking of smoke and ash. He pressed it into her hands. "Cover your mouth," he rasped. "It helps." She nodded, pressing the filthy fabric against her face. Her eyes watered above it, but her coughing eased slightly. They stumbled past the broken remains of Pompeii's pride. A marble satyr lay face down in the rubble, its leering grin buried in dust. The bread stall of Quintus, always more prosperous than Gaius's, smoldered unattended, flames licking at the expensive awning. A small boy sat in the middle of the road, crying over an empty leash, calling for a dog that wouldn't return. The southern gate appeared through the haze, its massive arch half choked with debris. Bodies pressed against it, a desperate mass of humanity with no guards to maintain order. The bronze hinges had cracked under pressure, one door hanging askew. Gaius spotted a family with a mule-drawn cart inching through the crush. He lunged forward, grabbing the wooden rail. "Help us climb!" he shouted to the father, a broad-shouldered man with terrified eyes. The man hesitated, glancing at his own children huddled in the back. Then, reluctantly, he reached down. "The girl first," he grunted. Gaius boosted Vibia up, and the stranger's calloused hands pulled her aboard. Gaius scrambled up after her, nodding silent thanks. From this height, they gained their first clear view of what remained of Pompeii. The sky hung dark as deepest twilight, though it couldn't have been past midday. Ash columns rose from multiple fires across the city. The great temple roofs had caved in completely. Marble columns lay scattered like discarded bones. A deafening rumble shook the earth. The mountain bellowed again, louder than before. Screams erupted around them. Some people dropped to their knees in prayer. Others abandoned their possessions entirely, running blindly toward the sea. Gaius's fingers tightened around Vibia's hand. A woman clinging to the cart's side looked up at Vibia, her face streaked with tears and soot. "Did anyone warn us?" she asked, voice hollow. Vibia met her gaze, expression unreadable behind the cloth. "Some of us tried," she said quietly. "They just weren't listening." The cart creaked as it crested the final hill overlooking the bay. The water stretched before them, glinting dully through the haze. Not salvation, merely distance from what they'd lost. Gaius turned back one last time. Pompeii had nearly vanished, just vague shapes in a cloud of smoke. The city that had ground him down for decades, extracted his dignity coin by coin, was disappearing from existence. He said nothing, simply turned forward again, facing whatever future remained. Golden light spilled across the inland village, turning humble clay walls into burnished bronze. Days had passed since the mountain's fury, and here the air tasted clean, filled with birdsong and the earthy scent of recent rain. Fields of wheat stretched beyond the cluster of homes, swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. Gaius sat cross-legged by the communal fire pit, surrounded by other Pompeians who'd fled with nothing but the clothes on their backs. His tunic bore the marks of their new life, patches sewn with borrowed thread, smudges of clay from helping rebuild a fallen wall. His hands, once calloused from hauling bread crates, now sported fresh blisters from cutting timber. But for the first time in weeks, perhaps months, his shoulders weren't hunched with tension. He kneaded dough in a clay bowl, working it with unhurried movements. No weights to measure, no inspectors hovering, no rival vendors eyeing his technique. Just flour, water, and salt. The same recipe he'd used for years, yet somehow transformed. Each fold felt deliberate rather than desperate. Try this. A woman with soot-streaked gray hair offered him a pinch of wild herbs from her palm. Her eyes crinkled with kindness as she sprinkled some into her own batch. Rosemary makes the bread sing. Gaius hesitated, then accepted. I never added anything before. Too expensive. We share what we know now. She shaped her dough with practiced hands. There's no room for secrets here. Beneath a gnarled fig tree at the edge of the gathering, Vibia sat with bare feet buried in cool grass. A fresh notebook of bound parchment, gifted by a grateful merchant they'd helped along the escape route, rested in her lap. Her quill moved with confident strokes, no longer hidden beneath blankets or behind closed doors. A small boy with curious eyes peered over her shoulder. What's it about? Vibia looked up, a soft smile replacing her usual guarded expression. A city that fed its people lies instead of bread, and a girl who learned how to feed them truth. The boy nodded solemnly, as if he understood perfectly, then darted away to chase a chicken. Gaius glanced toward his daughter, watching her in a way he never had in Pompeii, not with worry about her sharp tongue bringing trouble, not with disappointment at her rejection of their life. Instead, he observed with quiet admiration. The eruption had revealed her strength while stripping away his fear. He saw her not as fragile, but as forged in fire. The fire pit crackled as Gaius placed his first loaf onto a flat stone. The bread looked nothing like his precisely shaped Pompeii loaves. This one was round, imperfect, with uneven edges. No glaze, no stamp, just honest bread meant for sharing, not selling. Villagers gathered as the aroma of baking filled the air. Children clapped when steam rose from the crust. No coins changed hands, only nods of appreciation and murmured thanks. Vibia closed her notebook and joined the circle, settling beside her father. Gaius broke the warm loaf in half, handing her the larger piece without comment. They ate in companionable silence, side by side. For the first time in years, maybe ever, the bread tasted like more than mere survival. It tasted like beginning again.